Okay.
Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Emerson Green. Today I'm speaking with Matthew Adelstein of the channel Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions about utilitarianism. Would you mind briefly introducing yourself before we dive in?
Yeah. So I'm Matthew. I'm a pretty ardent utilitarian. That's an important, I claim about my identity before I get into the details about other things. I have a channel, Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions, which you should all subscribe to immediately and watch a significant portion of the videos of. You have decisive, normative reasons to do so. And I also have a blog called Bentham's Bulldog, um, where I talk about utilitarianism mostly, and occasionally some other stuff like destroying physicalism in one simple article and why God does not exist.
Yeah, so I asked you on because you're a passionate utilitarian, and I'm not a passionate anything when it comes to normative theories. I do think a lot of the objections to utilitarianism are fairly lame, and I don't understand why it makes a number of people very angry, because it's clearly like a plausible and powerful ethical theory. But I'm just not willing to bite all the bullets that many utilitarians, including yourself, seem willing to bite. So I just don't think there's like a perfect normative theory out there. And I guess maybe we'll touch on my low effort pluralism as we go along. But before we divide up the major three branches of ethics, did you want to add anything at this point?
Well, I would obviously disagree with the notion that there's no perfect theory of normative ethics. There is a perfect theory of normative ethics. It's
Mm-hmm.
utilitarianism, specifically hedonic act utilitarianism. But I just before we go into the details, I think that the objections to utilitarianism are basically it diverges from our intuitions somewhat, and I think that that's somewhat reasonable. Intuitions are how we know things about morality, but given our poor moral track record, we would expect the correct moral view to diverge from our intuitions somewhat, given how much moral disagreement there is, and that lots of people throughout history have been okay with slavery, subjugation of women, and genocide. And so, given that we'd expect the correct theory to accord with to diverge from our intuition somewhat, even in ways that are pretty strong. Um, uh, the fact that utilitarianism sometimes diverges from our intuitions, that's not any evidence against it, because it's what we would expect on the hypothesis that it was correct. But I think that when we really reflect across a wide range of cases, we find that all the apparent counterexamples end up backfiring and end up supporting utilitarianism.
Okay, yeah, well, we're going to talk about those counterexamples. And I hadn't even thought about the moral intuition thing exactly. But yeah, that's an interesting topic because some people seem to think that moral intuitions are not a valid way of justifying moral claims, which I'm pretty sure we're both in agreement that that's wrong. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Then how do we justify any moral claim?
right. Yeah. Well, scientific facts and evidence, obviously. Or morality is just not real. I, we have a really good question right out of the gate. Why do you believe that utilitarianism is true if it is false?
Well, I don't believe that utilitarianism is true if it is false.
Well,
Um,
I think that it's been debunked, and I think we're going to have to end the stream right now. But
okay.
I actually did want to take 5 or 10 minutes before we dive into utilitarianism and sort of bring everyone up to speed with basic stuff that you kind of need to be conversant in moral philosophy. Just a few minutes for like 101 level stuff, and then we'll get on to the main subject. Because there are a couple things I guess I wish that someone had said to me, like when I was first thinking about this stuff, years ago. Um, if you look in any like intro philosophy book in the chapter about ethics, this will all be in there. This isn't like groundbreaking stuff, but I just didn't know where to look. I was listening to like atheist YouTube channels and podcasts, and I was like, uh, either misled or just not told certain things that I wish I had known. So I'm just going to mention 5 things that I think are kind of useful to give people the lay of the land. And then if you want to chime in at the end with any other sort of basic tools that you need, then yeah, feel free to do that. So, first, I think you need to know that there are descriptive statements and evaluative statements. Descriptive statements are value free, like water is H2O, and if I set Matthew on fire, it will cause him a great deal of pain. Those are just descriptive facts. Evaluative statements or normative statements make value judgments, like it would be wrong to set Matthew on fire and cause him a great deal of pain. So, once you're talking about should or ought or some respect in which something is good or bad, then you're outside the category of descriptive statements. Um, Pretty much everyone agrees that descriptive statements can be objectively true or false. There are descriptive facts. but not everyone agrees that evaluative statements can be objectively true or false. There's comparatively more disagreement about whether evaluative statements can be objectively true or false. Are there moral facts or objectively true and false answers to moral questions? There are other evaluative statements as well beyond moral statements. Statements about what is beautiful, what is, I don't know, mean-spirited or nice, or what is rationally justified. Those all have as a part of their meaning that something is good or bad in a certain respect. So it's an evaluative statement, even though it's not moral. So descriptive statement, you're being logically inconsistent. That's just, that could be a descriptive fact about the world. Evaluative statement, it's bad to be logically inconsistent. You shouldn't be logically inconsistent. This next one is just kind of small. It's just that ethical and moral are interchangeable. So that's just something that was just one of those things that I had heard early on. Like someone very confidently said, and like on some atheist YouTube channel I was listening to years and years ago, that there was this big difference between what's ethical and what's moral. So that's not true. I mean, in moral philosophy, ethical and moral are used interchangeably. Yeah, just random thing that was specific to my circumstance. But even if there's just one other person who was told that, it would be nice to be disabused of that. So lastly, and this is relevant to what we're talking about today, ethics is typically divided into three branches: applied ethics, normative ethics, and meta-ethics. Applied ethics has to do with practical issues like abortion, environmentalism, veganism, drag queen story hour, really fun topics like that. And normative ethics is what will mostly be under discussion today. So, utilitarianism or consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, those are typically considered the big three normative theories. And normative theories are aiming to explain rightness and wrongness in abstract systematic terms. So like what makes an action right, or what makes a law moral or immoral, and so on. And as I mentioned, I don't really think there is a perfect normative theory out there. I know you do. There's almost certainly a name for my view, but I don't think about normative ethics enough to even know what it is. Maybe it's connected to the failure of conceptual analysis more generally, my views about that. But anyway, so there's applied ethics, there's normative ethics, and then there's meta ethics, which is about the nature of morality and moral truths. So, are there objective moral truths? Are there objective values? Objective meaning, are there ethical statements that are true, independent of the attitudes of the observers towards the things being evaluated? Yeah, so those are the just the things I wanted to cover, just to sort of bring everyone up to speed and give them the lay of the land. So is there any other sort of foundational thing that you wanted to mention before we zoom in on utilitarianism?
No, nothing in particular.
Okay, cool. So what is the one sentence formulation of utilitarianism as you see it?
So do what maximizes the happiness minus suffering of conscious creatures. One should do what maximizes the happiness minus suffering of conscious creatures.
Okay.
No, I mean, specifically, I think that there's a more complicated scalar account where really it's how important it is that you do a thing is proportional to how much it would increase the well-being of conscious creatures. So it's not just that it is right to do the best thing, it's that rightness scales proportional to how much you do the right thing. But that's the basic picture.
But who could possibly have a problem with that?
I know. I feel the same way, Emerson.
Okay, so I mean, what are the? I mentioned the two major competing normative theories, virtue ethics and deontology. So, I mean, how would you contrast utilitarianism with deontology and virtue ethics, and why are you not, a deontologist or a virtue ethicist?
Well, so we can start with virtue ethics. I think one of the problems with virtue ethics is that it doesn't say anything. So virtue ethics says that what determines what we should do is what a virtuous person would do. But of course, that raises the deeper question of what would a virtuous person do. And it seems like virtue ethics just has no deeper story to tell about what it is that makes it so that we should do certain things. It doesn't seem like a legitimate contrast to utilitarianism. And furthermore, there are many cases in which you should make yourself wax virtuous. So if I had to take a pill that would turn me evil but would prevent a genocide, that would obviously be good. I mean, I think that when you the more virtue ethicists you read, the more it just becomes clear that they're not saying anything.
I've slowly been getting Aristotle pilled over the last couple of weeks, and the thing that I came across on virtue ethics was, I mean, sort of the short answer I heard to this was, a virtuous person wouldn't need to ask that question. Like a virtuous person will just know what is virtuous to do as they grow in virtue.
Okay, but then that doesn't help us answer any important moral questions. So, and there are clearly disagreements between virtuous people about things like, eating meat, whether we should be long-termists, whether the ethics of particular wars, etc. So I think that account is wildly unsatisfactory. Now maybe I just am lacking in virtue such that I need to ask such questions, but
yeah, I mean, you think it's not very informative, and you think it doesn't help resolve moral disagreements or inform actual choices in the real world.
Right. And I think that if you look at the track record of our intuitions, they're often wrong. And so if it's just take a guy, make him virtuous, and then have them make decisions, well, that's not very helpful, because it's not clear that they're going to be making very good decisions. Given we need a formula to make sure we're doing the right thing.
Couldn't someone, kind of level the same objection to utilitarianism, though? Like it doesn't actually tell you what will maximize well-being, so it's ultimately not very informative.
Well, there's a distinction in that utilitarianism has a formula in principle for determining what we should do. Now, that formula in principle will often face significant factual hurdles, but there's at least a metric for determining what we should do. While with virtue ethics, there is no metric even in principle. And so it's no problem that utilitarianism is often hard to apply. And in fact, that's what we would expect of the correct ethical theory. Given how difficult ethics is, we wouldn't expect the correct ethical theory to just give us very easy answers to all moral questions. We would have to make significant judgment calls. But utilitarianism has the advantage of it being solvable in principle.
Okay, so I mean, let's just touch on deontology. I'm kind of fearful that some people are not going to be very satisfied with some of my pushback, but like I said, this is something that I just don't think about very often. Like I'm sort of interested in meta ethics. I'm relatively more interested in applied ethics, but I don't know, normative ethics has never really grabbed me the way that it does with some people. So I apologize if I'm not defending virtue ethics as valiantly as some people would like. But so deontology, I mean, this one seems kind of more straightforward. I mean, like as soon as you bring up deontology, everyone says the same thing, which is just like, okay, so Anne Frank is in your attic, the Nazis are at your door, and you can't lie. Like you can't just say no, there's no one in my attic.
Well, I think that the more moderate deontologists can say that in that case you should lie. The harms of a lie maybe make it so that all else equal you shouldn't do it. But so like Michael Huemer, for example, who's a deontologist, would I think almost certainly say you should lie about having Anne Frank in your attic. But I think that there are just a multitude of problems with deontology. There's an efficiently large number that like it would take me like a half hour to spell out all of them, so I won't, obviously. But just for a few brief ones. Well, one of them is that I think that there is no very satisfactory account of rights that deontology can give. What is the foundation of rights? Well, I think that utilitarianism offers a great foundation of rights. All the things that we think of as rights happen to be heuristics for maximizing well-being. So, for example, the right to life tends to produce good outcomes, similarly to the right to property, and all the other rights. Well, deontology has to posit that that's just some vast coincidence. And in fact, in cases where there's a rights violation, the rights that we have are fairly arbitrary legal arrangements of things that we can do with our property, if and only if they, that we have the ability to do with our property. So, I mean, take the example of emitting noise. Well, if we think about the difference between emitting noise and shooting people, I mean, there are some significant differences. But whenever you emit noise, you're shooting sound waves into people's ears without their prior consent. I mean, that seems like it could plausibly be a rights violation. you're literally shooting small projectiles into their body without their consent. But it's obviously not, because it produces good outcomes. But in cases where it doesn't, we think that it is a rights violation. So if you made a deafening roar that deafened the entire street, we would think that that's a rights violation. A similar example can be seen with, you have the right not to let other people enter your house, but you don't have the right not to let other people look at your house. Well, there's a pragmatic reason for that. But I mean, what's the fundamental difference between staring at a house and being in the house? And I think that when we just consider the rights in enough detail, they just all seem to be well-being maximizing heuristics. For example, you look at the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It lists a bunch of rights, and they all happen to produce good consequences, which would just be a massive, or arguably, which would just be a massive coincidence on deontology. But utilitarianism can explain. So that's one objection. Do you want to push back on that, or should I?
No, I mean, so it sounds like you're saying that the deontologist, who's not, I heard Michael Huemer say this one time as well, where he's like, deontologists are allowed to lie, if in that sort of situation. The only person who would disagree are insane people like Immanuel Kant. But yeah, I guess that more moderate deontologists don't have that kind of view that would commit them to that. So, but there are, deeper problems with deontology that don't just involve, the kind of standard appeal to those sorts of cases where it seems like obviously you should violate these things that are supposed to be inviolable rules. And it seems like we can explain why we should violate them purely in terms of the consequences.
Right.
Are there is there any other well, I mean, let's just go to utilitarianism so we can contrast it with the other two theories and why you think it's just the better theory. So presumably you think that there are cases where utilitarianism can explain something that seems right, where deontology and virtue ethics would kind of lead you to the wrong answer.
Yeah, but I do think that, well, I mean, virtue ethics has the advantage of not giving clear answers. And so the virtue ethicist doesn't say anything. But I certainly think that there are a variety of cases in which utilitarianism gives the right answer rather than deontology. So to give one example, so let's say that you plant a landmine in the park because you're evil, okay? As one does. And then you have remorse. And so you decide that that you shouldn't violate rights, and you become deontology pilled. And so then you go back to the park, but you see, so your landmine's about to blow up a kid. But then you see 5 other landmines that will blow up 5 other kids not placed down by you. Well, and you can either get undo your own landmine or undo the 5 landmines that were set by other people. So in this case, it seems really obvious that you should undo the 5 other landmines set by other people. And yet, in this case, it's a direct choice between choosing for a world in which you violate one right, blowing up a kid, or 5 other people violate 5 rights. And so the deontologist would have to hold the opposite judgment. And yet that seems really unintuitive. That's one example. There are more cases. So one case, I think, is when it comes to birth. I mean, birth just seems like it would be a clear candidate on non-consequentialist accounts for a rights violation. Whenever you have a kid, what's happening is you're causing a person to endure immense suffering, way more suffering than would occur as the result of a random assault. This person cannot consent to the action. It will maybe bring about more happiness than suffering, but it forces upon them immense suffering. There's a decent chance that it'll cause them to be the victim of some crime of some sort. And so then there's a high chance that it will result in at least one rights violation. So I think deontology is committed to antinatalism. And yet I think that most of us correctly recognize that antinatalism, if the kid's going to have a good life, is really unintuitive. So I think utilitarianism makes good account of that.
No, I've noticed that a lot of antinatalists, they do make this kind of this kind of appeal, like, well, look, it's always wrong to inflict suffering on someone without their consent, and having children is like the ultimate example of that. And like a lot of the times the case seems to end there. I mean, just for like antinatalists in the wild, obviously there are like better defenses of it, but I've seen that like multiple times where they're like, look, this is the principle I'm working with, this is wrong, period, and having kids violates this principle. I mean, that is how a lot of them tend to argue. I have encountered just as many like non-utilitarian antinatalists as utilitarian antinatalists.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's one other case that I think is a good example. A third case is in terms of degrees of wrongness. So suppose that you have to make the choice between two actions. Action one would say that that you inflict 4 units of suffering on someone, certainly. And action two would say that you have a 50% chance of inflicting 10 units of suffering. Well, action one seems clearly better. The person is better off in expectation. But if they're both rights violations, the first one, so then a 50% chance of one rights violation, or 100% chance of one rights violation versus a 50% chance of another rights violation plus the 10 units of suffering. Seems like the deontologist would have to hold that the first one would be that the 50% chance of inflicting 10 units of suffering would be worse. Now, what they might say is that the badness of a rights violation scales proportional to the amount of suffering caused. But then if that's the account, then acts that don't cause any suffering can't be rights violations. And yeah, that's not a principle that the deontologist would want to hold, given that they want to hold that, for example, if you spied on someone without their knowledge or consent, that would be a rights violation. And so they just don't want to hold that that if you take some action, even if no one's harmed, that it's not a rights violation. And so to get around these two intuitions, they have to rig up some complicated account of things with zero suffering can still be rights violations, but suffering doesn't scale proportional to rights violations. Or it does to some degree, but they have to make it this complex formula while utilitarianism offers this really simple account.
Yeah. Degrees of wrongness seems like a pretty straightforward win for utilitarianism. They definitely have the easiest time accounting for the, it does seem like a fact that there are degrees of wrongness. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this? There was a question in the chat that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I'll just give, I have in my book in progress, I have 11 cases where I think utilitarianism clearly beats out the other theories. I think that the alleged counterexamples are also cases, but 11 cases that I think are particular examples. So I'll just list one more, which is children. So actually, I'll list two more. So first one's children. Children, I think, deontologists can't say that children have rights in the same way that other people do, right? So there are many facts about children that are best explained by utilitarianism. So here are several things that you can do to children, but not to adults. You can compel them to do minimal forced labor, i.e. chores. You can compel them to spend hours a day at school, even when they vehemently dissent and don't want to be at school. Force them to learn things like multiplication, even if they don't want to. Force them to go to bed when their parents think it'll make things go fast rather than when they want to. Not allow them to leave their house, however much they protest. Discipline them in ways that cause them to cry, for example, putting them on timeout, and controlling the food they eat, who they spend time with, what they do, where they are at all times. Now, these are just basic things that happen in parenting. Yet these seem like clear candidates for a rights violation. So the deontologist has to hold that your rights change when you hit 18 years of age. They scale over time. But here are many things that you can't do with kids that you can do with adults that consequentialism explains. Well, you can't have sex with kids, even if they verbally consent. You can't not feed them. So if one doesn't feed their kid, generally, if you not taking the action to feed someone isn't a rights violation for an adult. But if you don't feed your kid, you've obviously killed them, and employing them in damaging manual labor. And so all these facts are best accounted for by utilitarianism. And then the last case that I'll give is just sort of mundane actions in daily life. So whenever you drive your car, you're changing traffic patterns somewhat, such that you're changing when people will have sex slightly, which means that you change the distribution of future people. And so just plausibly every time you drive your car, you change the identity of a new future person. And so over the course of your life, you've no doubt changed the identity of enough people to cause several new people who will go on to commit heinous crimes to be born, and prevent several new other people who will not commit heinous crimes who would have otherwise from being born. And so why isn't that a rights violation? You're taking an action that has a 50% chance that will change the identity of people, such that over the course of your life, you'll prevent a reasonable number of crimes, of rights violations, but you'll also cause a similar number of rights violations. So Mogensen and McCaskill in a paper on this gave the example of, let's say that you roll the dice or you flipped a coin. If it's heads, you kill a random person. If it's tails, you save a random person, but you definitely win $5. Well, that seems wrong on deontological counts, right? But that's structurally analogous to what you do every time you drive your car. So deontologists can't drive or move, now, I mean, I wouldn't mind if the deontologist never drove or moved, but.
Okay, well, that one's a little weirder than the previous two. You had me. I was definitely nodding along with the first two, but I'll have to think more about not driving or moving. Yeah, I mean, it would be better for like a deontologist here who could say something in response. But I did want to bring up one question that Dominic asked. He said, only absolutist deontology seems committed to antinatalism. Very, very few contemporary deontologists are absolutists. And he added, everyone should check out Matthew's channel. By the way, he has some great content.
Yes.
So I was just saying, all I was saying was that a lot of antinatalists argue like deontologists, in my experience. Matthew was saying something stronger, though.
Yeah, so I think that I like the second comment more than the first. So I don't think that that's true, given that it's very plausible that if you have a kid, that will add at least one right, that will cause at least one rights violation. So either your kid will violate someone else's rights, or their rights will be violated, or there's at least a significant chance of that. And so, I mean, I think it would depend on how much weight we put on rights violations. But given that the deontologist presumably holds that you shouldn't, kill one person to save five, it seems like the antinatalist would have to hold that if there was a reasonable chance that if having birth is a rights violation and causes other rights violations down the line, that the threshold for the justification for having a kid is much higher than on utilitarianism. So utilitarianism would just hold that if you're having kids with good lives, that's perfectly fine. Well, deontology has to hold that no, it has to overcome some threshold in order to be justified. I don't think that this is a knockdown objection, but I think that this is just one other case where I think utilitarianism has a bit of an explanatory advantage.
I'll also say that, since we're talking about pretty abstract arguments right now, or just, which is a slightly better explanation of something that's, widely agreed upon, utilitarians have come out on top on a lot of practical issues. Like if we're talking about historically, famous deontologists like Kant and famous utilitarians like Bentham or Mill, and you ask who's more moral, well, it was obviously the utilitarians. Like they came to the right answer by modern standards, at least, like way more often than Immanuel Kant, who is like, it's like, oh yeah, this guy, he figured out morality. Also, don't pay attention to the way he acted or behaved in his personal life, because he was like extremely racist and behaved very poorly in many, many circumstances. But he figured out morality though. And then but utilitarians are evil. And, Mill and Bentham, they were way, way ahead of their time on animal rights, on women's equality, on anti-slavery. Like utilitarians historically have been on the right side of a number of issues, and deontologists and virtue ethicists were busy, justifying slavery.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point, and that is the type of thing that we'd expect of the correct moral theory. So when it seems weird, it'll turn out to be correct. So, just to give one example, Bentham supported legalizing homosexuality sometime in the 1700s, and his writings on the subject were so liberal that they were not published for 2 or so centuries. So, like, he was too progressive for like 1980s America, and he was writing this in like the 1780s or 90s. Mill advocated giving women the right to vote, and they were all big advocates. They were all opposed to slavery and advocates of greater racial equality. And Sidgwick was a big advocate of greater rights to education for women. So I think the historical record really favors utilitarianism, unlike Kant, who thought it was okay to kill bastard children, children who were like born whose parents were not married, that they could just be killed. Bastard children was his word, not how I referred to them.
Okay, so I did want to run through a couple of common objections to utilitarianism. So these are, counterexamples where it seems like the right thing to do is not what would produce the greatest good for the greatest number. So that would seem to be a counterexample to the very broad claims of utilitarianism. So I'm borrowing these 4 examples straight from Knowledge, Reality, and Value by Michael Huemer. Okay, so you ready for the first one?
Yeah.
Okay, so Huemer actually raised this when he was on your channel debating utilitarianism. That was a good debate, by the way. But anyway, so the first counterexample is framing. A crime has been committed in a certain town that has caused great public outrage. The sheriff knows that if no one is punished, there will be riots. Unfortunately, the sheriff cannot find the actual criminal, but he can frame an innocent person, causing that person to be punished and thus forestalling the riots. The innocent person would be seriously harmed, but this would be a smaller total quantity of harm than the harm that would be caused by the riots. Should the sheriff frame the innocent person? So obviously the intuitive answer is no, but it seems that utilitarian principles would lead you to do an immoral thing there.
Yeah. So I think that in terms of that case, I've written something about that case. I'm trying to find. Oh, okay, yeah. So I think that for one, utilitarianism can make sense of the intuition that in the vast majority of cases, people should not frame innocent people. But so in this specific case, I think that we do have decisive reason to frame the innocent people or the innocent person. So so one argument for this is suppose that you could either prevent 5 murders from a mob or 1 innocent person from being framed and killed by a lynch mob. So surely in that case, if it was just a choice between 1 person from being framed and killed or 5 people from being killed and not being framed, well, in that case, clearly the 5 people being killed and not framed, that would clearly be worse. So
wait, are they? Is everyone innocent in this scenario?
Yes, everyone's innocent. So if we're just deciding which state of the world is better, one where the 5 people are killed, and the one where the 1 person's killed, it seems clearly that the one where the 5 people are killed is a worse world than the one where the 1 person is killed. And it seems plausible that it's good to do things that make the world better. That if you can either make the world better or worse, you should make the world better. And if you say that you should maintain the status quo rather than make the world better, so that you don't have blood on your hands, then I think that seems to be a form of status quo bias, where one just privileges the status quo. And that when you really reflect about what's important about the case and think about the people who are affected by this, the many people who will be killed if you don't take the action, and you think about what's really important about the case, which is the lives involved, then the intuitive judgment changes.
Well, hang on. So Sheriff Matthew would turn the innocent person over to the lynch mob in order to prevent the rioting.
Right. And so, given that would save the most lives, that would be the best for people overall. Now, would you agree, Emerson, that the world in which 1 person is framed is better than the world in which the 5 people are framed? Or sorry, the 5 people are killed and not framed. If we're just comparing states of the world.
Well, let's just stay within the sheriff case. So, I mean, the case we're contemplating is 1 innocent person framed or riots, which could lead to more people dying or something. I mean, I wouldn't see this is like my intuitions are obviously attuned to real world cases, and in the real world, framing an innocent person, the police framing someone who's innocent is not going to have overall good consequences. So like in these hypothetical scenarios, it's usually just been stipulated that the thing that would normally happen in the real world just won't happen. So I think that some of these actions, like it's clear that you shouldn't frame people, for crimes they didn't commit. The police should not do that in the real world. And then when you bring up that situation and then you just stipulate, oh, but none of the things that would actually happen would happen in this scenario. I'm allowed to do that because this is a thought experiment. So I can just stipulate that the normal rules don't apply. And then our minds have this reaction like, okay, but you still shouldn't do that. Because those types of actions would obviously be wrong in the real world, even by utilitarian standards. So I'm just like less enthusiastic about biting the bullet than you are, because you seem to just be going along with the stipulations and then saying like, yeah, okay, I would bite that bullet. But for me, I'm like, I just can't get over the fact that I would never actually do this in real life, and I don't think you would either.
Well, so there's no real life situation in which I would do it. But if God informs me that I would be successful in framing the innocent person, and it would prevent, a series of riots that would kill 5 people, and I have, total certainty that I would get away with it, that there would be no backlash, etc., which is not a situation that's likely to arise, then that's, I think, the relevant case. But okay, so
So sorry, just to be clear, Sheriff Matthew would not actually turn over the innocent person if you
Sheriff Matthew would turn only if Sheriff Matthew was hearing voices in his head from God.
Right.
Would he turn over the innocent person? But but in the case, so then the unintuitive judgment as well. But if you heard a voice from God saying that there will be no negative side effects, and you knew it with absolute certainty, people think it's still unintuitive. But so if we think about that case, so I think, just to simplify the case, rather than making it a riot, let's just say that there's a mob who's about to kill 5 people unless they figure out who did it. And so if you frame one person, then they won't kill 5 people. Well, in that case, I think that this argument will have a few premises. So one, if it's true that you should frame one innocent person to save 5, to prevent 5 killings, or sorry, if you should frame one person to prevent 5 framings, then you should frame one person to prevent 5 killings.
Right.
Second,
yeah, it seems pretty obvious that if your choices are 5 people are going to be framed or 1 person is going to be framed, then yeah, you should pull the trolley lever and just have the 1 person framed.
Right. And so now, so if we accept that, so premise 1, if you should frame one innocent person to prevent 5 framings, then you should frame one innocent person to prevent 5 killings. Premise 2, you should frame one innocent person to prevent 5 framings. Therefore, you should frame one innocent person to prevent 5 killings. Now, the arguments for premise 2 are as follows. So one of them is that this, I can't go into the details here. This would take too long. But you get problematic paradoxes when you say that some action shouldn't be taken even to prevent more of the action. You get an explosive principle where Richard Yetter-Chapel wrote about this in an article called "The Cost of Constraints." There are other paradoxes that you can get, and it also seems to rob the intuition of its force, because the reason why it seems bad to frame a person is it seems like there's something about that is just how bad it is to frame an innocent person, to send them off to jail for a crime they didn't do, or to get them killed by a mob or whatever. But in this case, you don't care about the framing, right? What you care about is making sure that you're not the one who does the framing, because you're perfectly fine having more overall framing as long as you're not the one who gets blood on your hands. And yet, it seems like what matters about the framing is the framing itself, not who's doing it. Claiming that something like framing is so bad that you shouldn't do it even to prevent more framing, it seems to me much like saying that some numbers are so big that even if you multiply them by 5, they get smaller. If it's so horrible, then you should want there to be less framing. But then the second argument for this conclusion, that you should frame one innocent person to prevent 5 framings, is that, so now let's imagine a modification of the landmine scenario. So let's say you sent a letter in the mail to frame an innocent person. And while you're on your way, and so then you become a moral person, and you decide to take your letter out of the mail. So you reach into the mailbox. This mailbox is a very strange security system, where so you can only take out one envelope. And then there's one other envelope that will frame 5 people. And so you can either take out your envelope, such that you won't have violated any rights, or you could take out the envelope that will frame 5 people. Well, it seems like in this case, you should obviously take out the envelope that will frame 5 people. And yet in this case, you're choosing between one world in which you frame one innocent person, and another world in which you frame 5 innocent people. Or sorry, in which other people frame 5 innocent people. And so this world seems structurally analogous to the other framing case. This is a world where you're choosing between you framing one person and 5 other people framing one person. And so the deontologist seems to have to bite the bullet. Now, there are lots more things that can be said about this case. many of which I say in my blog post called "Contra Humor on Utilitarianism." I think part 4. But I don't want to give a 20-minute monologue about this case. So,
well, I mean, I can see how it benefits you to make it framing versus more framing, But I think that the case with the sheriff is a little harder for me because it's not framing versus more framing, which it seems obvious that like if framing is so bad, then you should want less of it. And sure, I don't want blood on my hands. I don't want to be, I would like to wash my hands of something if it's bad. Like I just don't want any part of it. But yeah, I mean, I can totally see the plausibility of the utilitarian position there. But I think that the sheriff case, it's not framing versus more framing. It's like framing versus rioting where a lot of people could get hurt and that sort of thing. So it's, I feel like that particular objection doesn't really apply to the sheriff case.
Well, okay, but then so you would reject the premise. So okay, but given that what I said before, would you accept that you should frame one innocent person to prevent 5 killings?
Framing versus killing, yes.
Okay, and so if we predict that it will result in several killings, then it seems like 5 killings plus a riot is clearly worse than 5 killings. So by transitivity, it seems like that would give us the judgment about the riot case that you should.
I mean, I think in the specific case, I think it was all just harm versus harm. Like the person who you frame gets harmed, but they're not killed. And in the rioting, there's property damage and there's harm. But I think that I don't think he mentioned anyone dying.
Right, but the thing. So if you make it so that it's not about anyone dying, well, so now we can go back to the sheriff case. So it's just framing one innocent person or have a riot that harms 2 innocent.
I mean, the conflict is supposed to be you have clearly more harm on one side of the scale, way more harm than on the other. But there's framing involved in the part with less harm. So it feels like that's, you shouldn't frame someone even though it would lead to less harm overall. I think most people would agree, like, yeah, you shouldn't frame an innocent person.
Well, okay, but so now let's compare framing one innocent. So let's say that there's a riot going on that will harm a bunch of people, and you have a choice between would you accept that a riot that will harm a bunch of people is worse than 2 people being framed?
See, I don't know. That's what makes it hard is like, I mean, the reason this leads to a counterintuitive result is because it feels like it's just wrong to frame innocent people, even if it would lead to less harm.
But you don't think that, right? Because you think that you should frame an innocent person to prevent more framings. You should frame an innocent person to prevent killings. But you, for some reason, think that a riot, which will result in harm to lots of people at the cost of a framing, but that's not worth it. Even though the riot will be worse overall than the framing. And so if you accept that a riot, that if it will kill anyone, then you should frame an innocent person, and you accept that you should frame an innocent person to prevent extra framings, then it seems like that point, your judgment is just that framing simplicator is worse than a riot. And yet, at that point, you're basically agreeing with the consequentialist notion that you should do its best, but you're just disagreeing that a riot is worse. But I think that if we make it, so, I mean, you could make it a very small riot so that the amount of harm is less. But if it's a big riot, that will just, which has to be the case in order for it to be able to bite, then it's just obviously going to cause more harm than one person being framed. And so, like, it seems like, let's say you can, so in order to judge which is more important, let's say that you could either prevent 1 riot or 2 framings of innocent people. Which one should you prevent?
See, I think maybe we should move on to these other 3 cases because it's the same kind of thing,
It's on the ropes.
Well, I just mean it's the same kind of thing in every one of these cases. So maybe if we take it from a different angle, it'll seem more productive. But there are a couple things I wanted to bring up. Hello, Emerson Green. I subscribed to your channel a while back, but hadn't caught you live. First time in chat. Well, hello, atypical, asexual atheist.
Wait, I'm not sure if this person's saying that they are that they're atypical, or like as in not typical, or that they are saying that they are a example of a typical asexual atheist.
I think they're atypical, as in not typical. Or wait, that is, wouldn't it be? I don't know. The point is, we accept Carol the atheist. So Jeff Kane says, this is reminding me of Emerson's episode on why he doesn't like thought experiments. I mean, yeah, it's obviously related because we both agreed right away, well, if we were actually the sheriff, we would never do this. And then now we're just talking about, yeah.
Right, and I agree. So I don't go as far as you do, but I do agree that our judgments about thought experiments are really often unreliable. And so that's why I'm not willing to reject an otherwise beautiful theory that justifies lots of things, that explains lots of more practical real world scenarios, that explains why it's not wrong to drive your car, have intellectual property, have kids, like have banal interactions with kids, make noises sometimes, and that has, it's very theoretically elegant, parsimonious, has robust philosophical justifications in a variety of different ways. So there are lots of different axioms that you could derive it from. And then you have these weird convoluted scenarios that will never arise in the real world, for which it's like, take this thing that's bad 99.99% of the time. But then you stipulate that there's this crazy scenario that makes it not bad. Well, exactly. Our intuitions about the case are just obviously not going to be super reliable. And that just seems to be all the counterexamples, all the so-called counterexamples to utilitarians.
Yeah, no, I think that accounts for a lot of it. I mean, I don't want to go into the whole anti-thought experiment thing now, but like we are talking about normative ethics right now. You know, we're not even pretending that we're trying to inform action about what we would do if we were the sheriff, because we both agreed you shouldn't frame the person, because the way that the normal world actually is, the real world, this would not lead to the best outcome, even by utilitarian standards. But in the thought experiment, we just stipulate, hey, the normal rules don't apply. Okay, well, that's not a very good way to inform action in the real world, I think. But we're not really talking about applied ethics. We're talking about normative ethics. We're talking about the best theory that explains why certain things are right and other things are wrong. So I'm kind of fine with it in this case, because utilitarians and deontologists and virtue ethicists make these broad sweeping generalizations. And if you offer a counterexample to that sort of general principle, then, you know, I mean, that's totally fine. But yeah, that's more what we're doing here. There are a couple interesting questions I wanted to bring up as well. Like, why is Matthew a hedonist as opposed to an objective list theorist? I think pain and pleasure are factors in well-being, but what about things like autonomy or betrayal?
Yeah, so
you were just complaining about objective list theory, like literally right before we came on.
So I have 3 articles on the subject. One of them is Utilitarianism Wins Outright Part 3. One of them is Some Hedonist Intuitions. And one of them is called something about Pummer's argument for hedonism. I forget. Just go to Bentham's Bulldog and control F Pummer, and you'll find it. But so I think that, so one reason to be a hedonist is for parsimony reasons, holding that there's one thing that's good is simpler than holding that other things are good. I think objective list theory has to posit some vast coincidence that all the other things that we think of as good happen to generally produce well-being. So take autonomy. Autonomy tends to produce well-being. Betrayal tends to be bad for well-being. And that's just an enormous coincidence on objective list theory. Another piece of evidence for it, I think, is that only the types of beings that can experience well-being and suffering, only those types of beings matter. And that's predicted by hedonism. So it seems like a being matters if and only if it can experience well-being. That's what we would expect if well-being was all that matters, but not what we would expect on alternative hypotheses. And then one of the arguments that I find most persuasive is that if there were other things that positively contributed to well-being, say, let's give the example of knowledge for a moment, because this is the clearest case. Let's say knowledge made you well off. Well, then imagine a world in which you had unfathomable knowledge, but you were being waterboarded. Well, if the knowledge contributed positively to your well-being, you'd be really well off because you had so much knowledge. You know, it seems like if someone's doing really badly hedonically, then it doesn't matter how much knowledge they have. And so hedonism explains why at the extremes, what we care about is dominated by utility. There's nothing else that can outweigh fathomable amounts of utility in either direction. And it also explains why all the other things that we think of as being conducive to well-being are hedonist. It's also the simplest theory. It explains why all the beings that we think matter are the beings that can experience well-being. It explains why, for example, we don't have a reason to care about people after they're dead. I think that there are specific problems with objective list theory. So, I mean, take the example of autonomy. Well, it doesn't seem like, so autonomy seems good when it produces well-being. But for example, in cases where a person's seriously mentally ill and they'll bring about self-harm if they're given autonomy, it doesn't seem like autonomy is valuable in that case. The reason why betrayal seems bad is because because it's bad for well-being. But in cases where a betrayal was not bad for well-being, then we don't think that betrayal is bad. So, for example, if some criminal betrayed another criminal, got them caught so that they didn't commit a crime, then that seems like it wouldn't be a bad thing. Just a brief note on autonomy. Well, let's imagine an agent that had just so. I mean, I think that the lopsided lives argument about how in the long term things are dominated by well-being and suffering overall. So let's imagine that a being had infinite autonomy, so they could do anything except affect the well-being and suffering of the world, and they were horrifically miserable all the time. So they couldn't alleviate any of their horrific misery that was worse than being tortured. But other than that, or create other beings who had that, but other than that, they were omnipotent. Well, if autonomy is what matters, this being has the most possible autonomy. They can literally do anything except contribute change their well-being. And yet it seems like they wouldn't be well off. So utilitarianism explains that intuition. There are more objections, but again, I don't want to.
Yeah. I think we should talk about organ harvesting. We're not going to talk about the freaking trolley problem, but we are going to talk about organ harvesting. So now you're not a sheriff anymore. Now you're a doctor, and you have 5 patients who all need organ transplants, without which they will die. 1 needs a heart, 1 needs a lung, 1 needs a liver, and 2 need kidneys. At the same time, you have 1 healthy patient who just happens to somehow be compatible with all 5 of the sick patients. This healthy patient does not want to give up any of his organs, since that would kill him. You could nevertheless kill the healthy patient, harvest his organs, and thereby save 5 other patients. Should you harvest the organs?
Well, so there are obviously a bunch of caveats. So the real world, no, there's a high chance of getting caught, of it being unsuccessful. In general, doctors should not be thinking about considering harvesting their patients. There are a bunch of reasons why you again have to be reassured by God that you won't get caught, basically. But
yeah, you have to make all these stipulations that basically divorce it from any real world case. But yeah, since we're okay with that because we're talking about normative ethics and trying to find the correct theory, the correct analysis of right and wrong, then it's technically fine to like give these sort of stipulations that are just supposed to be counterexamples to the very broad principles that you're defending as a utilitarian.
Right. So I think that one of the most insightful things that was said on the topic came from Savolascu, who said, so the most straightforward case of impermissible killing, and the one in which he and many others have clear intuitions, is transplant. In transplant, a doctor contemplates killing 1 person and harvesting his or her organs to save 5 people with organ failure. This is John Harris's survival lottery. But this is a dirty example. Transplant imports many intuitions. For example, that doctors should not kill their patients, that those with organ failure are old while the healthy donor is young, those with organ failure are somehow responsible for their illness. This will lead to a slippery slope of more widespread killings. This will induce widespread terror at the prospect of being chosen, etc., etc. A better version of transplant is epidemic. Imagine an uncontrollable epidemic afflicts humanity. It is highly contagious, and eventually every single human will be affected. It causes people to fall unconscious. 5 out of 6 people will never recover and die within days. 1 in 6 people mounts an effective immune response. They recover over several days and lead normal lives. Doctors can test people on the 2nd day while still unconscious and determine whether they've mounted an effective antibody response or whether they are destined to die. There is no treatment, except one. Doctors can extract all the blood from the 1 in 6 people who mount an effective antibody response on day 2 while they're still unconscious and extract the antibodies. There will be enough antibodies to save 5 of those who don't mount responses, though the extraction procedure would kill the donor. The 5 will go on to live a normal life, and antibody protection will cover them for life. As Sevalescu points out, our intuitions about this case are way more sympathetic to the consequentialist picture. This is when we eliminate the morally irrelevant features of the situation. It seems much more intuitive that what the doctor is doing isn't wrong.
So we're still sacrificing 1 to save 5 here, but
right, to extract their antibodies to save 5. But if we had a choice between killing 1/6 of people and 5/6 of people, or superintending the deaths of 5/6 versus 1/6, it seems like it would be worse if 5/6 died.
Because we're talking about like a pandemic situation, not just like 6 people in a random hospital.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
In order,
I feel like that's relevant, don't you? Like, it's not just like 5 people in a hospital who are being saved by 1 person. It's like, 5/6 of humanity being saved by 1/6 of humanity.
Well, okay, but we can change it to make it so that that's not the case. So let's imagine that rather than afflicting all of the so that rather than afflicting all of humanity, it only afflicts one state. Let's say it only afflicts California. Well, in that case, our intuitions seem to be the same. So it's not about afflicting all of humanity, just about when we make it so that when we like scale it up, the utilitarian intuitions and that. But when it's a one-off thing that 99% of the time seems to be bad, then our intuitions about the case are wrong. Another point is, so our intuitions about the organ harvesting case seem to be reliant on the notion of rights. But I think there are just lots of structural problems with rights, some of which I described before, some of which I'll go on to describe now. So one point is that I think we have good scientific evidence that our intuitions about rights are fueled primarily by emotional reactions rather than careful, prolonged reflection. So it turns out that, for example, people with damaged VMPCs who are thus less emotional, VMPCs are responsible for emotions, are way more utilitarian across a wide range of cases. People have more time to reflect. You're like given drugs that make them less emotional, they become more utilitarian. So given that facts don't care about your feelings liberal, I think that the unreliable emotional intuitions are the ones that we shouldn't trust, and they tend to be non-consequentialist. And there's a wide array of evidence for this.
Every non-utilitarian is making an appeal to emotion fallacy.
Yeah, so true. I also think that rights run into a problem based on the aims of a benevolent third-party observer. So what I'm about to spell out is a reason why you should kill 1 person to prevent 3 killings or 2 killings. But it seems like if you should kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings, then you should kill 1 person to prevent 5 organ harvests or organ failure-related deaths, right? Preventing 5 deaths is more important than preventing 2 killings, assuming that people won't commit killings again, assuming holding all else equal. So it seems like if you're so it seems like, let's say you're deciding whether or not to kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings. Well, it seems like if we ask what a perfectly moral third party would hope you do, it seems like they would hope that you kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings. After all, in this case, it's from their perspective, given that they have no agent relative obligations, they're just deciding between 1 killing or 2 killings. And so in that case, from their perspective, it seems like they have the most reason to prefer a world in which you kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings. So premise 1, a perfectly moral third party should hope that you kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings. Premise 2, you should act the way that a perfectly moral third party would hope you would act. And this seems really intuitive. It seems strange that God would hope you do the wrong thing. And so then the conclusion follows that, therefore, you should kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings. And if you should kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings, you should kill 1 person to prevent 5 deaths from organ failure. Therefore, you should kill 1 person to prevent 5 deaths from organ failure. So that's one other counterexample. One more counterexample that I'll give. This is an objection to rights. So suppose that there are 100 circles of perfectly moral people. The first circle has 1 person, second circle has 5, third has 25, fourth has 125, 625, 625 times 5, etc. And so each person is paired with 5 people in the outer circle. So the first person is paired with all 5 people in circle 2. The 5 people in circle 2, each of them are paired with 5 people in circle 3, etc. And so the person in the first circle is given 2 options. Option 1 is kill 1 person. Option 2 is give the 5 people who you're paired with the same options that you were given. So basically pass the buck to the 5 people who correspond to you. And so if the buck keeps getting passed, then the people in the 100th circle, they don't have a choice. They cannot choose to choose option 2 because they're the last circle. So they would have to kill 1 person. So they would only have option 1. And so then the question, and all the people in all the circles are perfectly moral. They always do the right thing. So then the question is, well, which should you do? Well, the moderate deontologist would want to hold, I think, that you should take option 1. You should kill the person. Given that if you hold that you should pass the buck, that would mean that the next people should pass the buck, and the next people should pass the buck, and the next people should mean that you should bring about an action that you're given the choice between taking an action that will kill 5 to the power of 99 people and an action that will kill 1 person. And the moderate deontologist has to hold that you should kill 5 that you should, it seems like they're committed to holding that you should kill 1 person rather than allowing 5 to the power of 99 people to be killed. And so then, so it seems like they should take option 2. But they actually can't take option 2 without rejecting a very plausible moral principle, which is that giving perfectly moral people who always make the correct decision extra options can't make things worse. And this seems like a plausible principle. They'll always choose right. So how can it be bad to give them extra choices, give them an extra option? Well, so given they hold that you shouldn't kill 1 person to prevent 5 killings, if we accept that giving perfectly moral people extra options can't make things worse, then you certainly shouldn't kill 1 person to prevent 5 people who always make the correct decision from having 2 options, one of which is killing. And so that means that the moderate deontologist has to hold, so there are 3 propositions, and you have to hold, and you can't hold all 3 of them. One of them is that you shouldn't kill 1 person. You should kill 1 person rather than to prevent a state of affairs which you know will bring about the deaths of 5 to the power of 99 people. The second one is you should kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings. And the third one is that giving perfectly moral people extra options can't make things worse. And so I accept the 2 that are killing 1. I accept the 2 that are you should kill 1 person to prevent 5 to the power of 99 killings, and giving 1 perfectly moral person extra options can't make things worse. But the deontologist can't hold if they hold that you shouldn't kill 1 person to prevent 2 killings, then they have to either reject that you shouldn't kill 1 person to prevent 5 to the power of 99 killings, or that you shouldn't kill 1 person to prevent, or that giving perfectly moral people extra options can't make things worse. And yet, one of them is crazy, and it's like just the most extreme view of deontology. And one of them just seems like analytically false. If they'll always choose the right thing, how can it be bad to give them extra options? I know this example is maybe a bit confusing. For those who are interested, I have a blog post on this called Is Deontology Problematically Explosive? And so.
Yeah, no, this is like the second or third time I've heard you mention that, and I'm following it. I'm tracking with it more this time than I was the first 2 times, but I think I was just being thrown a little bit by the very simple math involved. That was throwing me off. But just to return to the organ harvesting case for a minute, I just want to get you on the record one more time. So Dr. Matthew in the real world is not going to harvest the organs, but Dr. Matthew in the thought experiment land is going to harvest the organs.
I would harvest the organs, right? I would harvest the organs if you give sufficient assurances that we know that I will get away with it. I won't get caught. The organs will be successful. They'll be the same like blood type and such, so that there won't be harmful. And so
it's not going to be a news story where suddenly people are afraid to go to the hospital because they think they're going to have their organs involuntarily harvested.
Right. Just one other brief point that's worth
no. Hang on. In the real world, you're not harvesting the organs, but in thought
Right.
experiment land, you are harvesting the organs.
Right. Unless God assures me that Well, then I would assume I was hearing voices, but so unless I had,
Okay.
Yeah, just one other very brief point about why in thought experiment land you should in fact harvest the organs. So there is a very plausible principle, which is the Pareto principle, which is that if X is good for some and bad for none, then X is good overall. So and from this you can derive that there is not a significant difference. The difference between the organ harvesting case and the trolley problem is smaller than the benefits of giving a chocolate bar to a random person, or any arbitrarily small benefit. So here's the way the argument is laid out. Premise one should flip the switch in the trolley problem. Most people accept this if you go by the poll results, and it's the large majority of philosophers. Premise two, organ harvesting, in the scenario described above, sorry, I forgot to describe the scenario above. So one's in a scenario that's a mix of the trolley problem and the organ harvesting case. There's a train that'll hit 5 people. You can redirect this train to kill 1 person, but you can also kill the person and harvest their organs, which would cause the 5 people to be able to move out of the way. So really you have 2 options for getting the people out of the way. One of them is harvesting the organs. One of them is flipping the switch. So the argument is as follows. One should flip the switch in the trolley problem. 2, organ harvesting in the scenario described above, plus giving a random child a candy bar is a Pareto improvement over flipping the switch in the trolley problem. After all, 1 extra child has a candy bar, and nobody else is either better or worse off. And so it's better for some and worse for none, and you should do actions that are better for some and worse for none. Premise 3, if action X is a Pareto improvement over an action that should be taken, then action X should be taken. So if some action's already good, and then you make an action that relative to it makes some people better off and no one worse off, then that's a better action. Which is very intuitive. And so then the conclusion, therefore, organ harvesting plus giving a random child a candy bar is an action that should be taken in the case described above. So you should, in the trolley problem, you should kill the person, harvest their organs, to redistribute the organs, to let the 5 people move out of the way. And it seems like if we should do that, then we should also do organ harvesting in general. Or not in general, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I should have named this like one of those capturing Christianity videos. It's like 150 arguments for utilitarianism. And then there can be some, deontologist or virtue ethicist who makes like a 12-hour response video where they debunk all of your 80 arguments for utilitarianism that you've made so far.
Well, I don't have, so in terms of how many arguments I think I have for utilitarianism, it'll depend on how we define arguments. But I think that there are lots of good arguments against like things that are that support particular tenets of utilitarianism. But in terms of just how many arguments there are with like premises or a conclusion where I think all the premises are really plausible and the conclusion is hedonic act utilitarianism is true, I think there are like 4 good arguments. And 2 of them are original to me.
Oh. Okay, do you want to move on to the promise case?
Yeah, we promised we'd do that, so.
Okay. Yeah, and it.
So well, no, actually, maybe we shouldn't do that then, because promises have no abiding moral force.
I know you're about to undermine the point that we should honor our promises if it doesn't maximize utility. So, you and your best friend have gotten caught in a snowstorm in Antarctica. At some point, it becomes clear that your friend won't make it out alive. He asks you to promise that when you return to civilization, you will make sure that his entire fortune goes to his son. You make the promise. But when you get back to civilization, you realize that your friend's son is probably just going to waste the money, and it would do much more good if given to charity. Should you tell everyone that your friend's dying wish was to give his entire fortune to charity?
No. So, in this case, so, right, and this is not even just in thought experiment land. In the real world, I would not tell them. I'd say that their dying wish was to give to against malaria.
I was going to say, this seems different than, like, I feel much less compelled to give the non-utilitarian answer here, where I'm like, who cares if the money goes to his dipshit kid who's just going to waste it all? Or you could give it to, like, an effective altruist charity or something and see it's like, who cares?
Yeah, no, I mean, it just seems like so obvious that the non-utilitarian intuitions are just like picking up on what things would like. They're like, wow, you like lied. I mean, in this case, it's like the Anne Frank and the Attic case. It's like you're lying to save the lives of like, let's say that they have, let's say they have $18,000. Well, I think you should lie to save the lives of 4 people who would otherwise die of malaria and prevent a bunch of other people from getting malaria. That seems incredibly obvious. And the non-utilitarian judgment that says that that it's more important that you don't tell a lie than that you save the lives of a bunch of people just seems obviously wrong. We reflect on what's really important about the scenario. I also think that, as per the principle I described above, if you accept that you should tell one lie to prevent two lies, which you should, otherwise you get cases like the cases that I described before, where things are problematically
the explosive cases, yeah.
Right. Then, so it seems like we have to say you should lie to prevent two other lies. And it also seems like you should lie to prevent, if you should lie to prevent two other lies, then you should lie to prevent 4 kids from dying of malaria. So therefore you should lie to prevent 4 kids from dying of malaria. Yeah, I have a, so in my book in progress, the section on this, the title of it is, why you should be lying to the dying, which I think is,
I mean, I feel like in the promise case, it's not just that you should honor your promise. It's also tied up with like property rights or something, like, oh, well, that was his money and he should get to decide like what is done with it, as opposed, even after he's dead, as opposed to you, even though you would use the money in a way that would, I don't know. It's not like I don't feel any pull in that direction, but I wouldn't really hold it against someone if they lied and gave all the money to charity.
Yeah, no, I mean, it just seems so obvious that the lives of several people are more important than giving extra money to dipshit kids so that they can buy a Rolex or whatever. Yeah, no, I mean, this, and if we accept Humer's judgment that, or sorry, not Humer's, Singer's argument, which I do, that not donating a few $1,000s to save a life is equivalent to walking past a drowning child, then the scenario becomes structurally analogous to, let's say your son was like, or your friend was like, give my money to my kids. Don't stop even for drowning children. Promise me. And you're like, okay. And then you see like 7 drowning children you can save, but your money's like deep in your pocket so that you'd have to wade in and like ruin the money. So like in that case, it just seems so obvious that you should save the kids. And yet it seems like it doesn't matter if the kids are far away and you're saving them from malaria, or if they're close and you're saving them from drowning. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. And I think that if, like, the only reason we have this intuition is because we like are thinking about it from the standpoint of us and our friend. But like, imagine, like, just think about it from the standpoint of the kid who's like dying of malaria. Like, imagine having to justify that decision. You're like, look, I could have saved your life and the lives of like your 4 friends. You're now about to die at like 6 years of age. I could have saved your life and the life of your 4 friends. But my friend made me promise to give some money to his kids. So sorry, but you have to take one for the team so that the kids can like invest it or buy a Rolex or something, or like get a nice car. I mean, it just seems so
even
obvious.
if it's not for something totally trivial. I mean, I guess in the thought experiment, it was stipulated that he wasted the money. So yeah.
Right, but even if they don't waste the money, like, I mean, unless they give it to EA Awards, if they spend
unless
it,
they go to patreon.com/counter or /WaldenPod, which would be very good usage of the money.
That's right. No, but I mean, it just seems so like this intuition just seems so bankrupt.
I do. I mean, one other thing though, I do think that maybe this is partially rooted in the idea of preferential treatment, which I hadn't thought of until you just said that thing of imagine it from the standpoint of, these kids who need like the bed nets or something. And on the one hand, like I do see that, but it reminded me that utilitarianism is supposed to be kind of impartial and agent neutral. Everyone's happiness is supposed to count the same, but most people, don't feel that way. They care more about their kids' happiness than they do about a kid in Africa's happiness. And I don't think that there's anything really wrong with that. And even if it's something kind of trivial, like, well, I want my kid to have my $18,000 that I was leaving him in my will or something like that, whether it's, 18,000 or 180,000 or 1.8 million or something. It seems like giving preferential treatment to your kids or your parents or something, that seems totally fine to me. Even if you're like privileging things for your kids that are not as important as the problems being faced by other people's kids in other countries or something. the idea that you would kind of privilege the needs of your own children over other people's children, that it would seem crazy to deny that to me. But it seems like utilitarianism is kind of committed to this impartiality and agent neutrality.
You're right. So I think that, well, so one, I think utilitarianism can provide a pragmatic account of why we ought to have um, agent neutrality, um, uh, sorry, of why we ought to have special obligations. So just society goes a lot better when you have a close-knit group of friends and family who you really care about. And so utilitarianism provides an account of maybe why it wouldn't be wrong for you to donate the money to your kid. But it seems like if another person's making a decision of whether to accurately report that you donated the money to your kid, that you wanted your kids to have the money, when they can save, a bunch of lives, it seems like they should save a bunch of lives. And in terms of the point about partiality, so my most, I mean, sorry to keep like referencing random blog posts that I've written, but there's like a lot to say on all these topics. In my debate with Arjun Paniksri, the written debate, I make a point about this. So one point is that if you just say that that the obligation to care a lot about your kid is independent of hedonic considerations, well, then this is collectively self-defeating and can be made infinitely collectively self-defeating. So let's say that Emerson and I both have a kid, and we can both either prevent our kid from experiencing 2 units of suffering 500,000 times, or prevent the other one's kid from experiencing 4 units of suffering. Well, if we both do, and let's say that they're currently experiencing 2 million units of suffering. Well, if we both do what's best for the other one's kid, then we'll both be better off, and neither of them will suffer. If we don't, then they'll suffer an arbitrarily large amount, experiencing, I think, 1 billion units of suffering, if I did the math right. So as a result of that, I think like it just that shows that if we divorce it from utilitarian considerations, you can just make things infinitely bad. And a good moral view generally doesn't result in infinitely bad things. Another point that I think is worth making is like the reason, like it seems like when what non-utilitarians want to say is like, look, my kid matters so much. I really care about them. Surely my kid matters so much that I don't have to like sacrifice their interests to help someone on the other side of the world. But I agree that your kid matters a ton. I just think that other kids who are other people's kids matter the same amount. And it seems like just objectively, your kids are no more important than other people's kids. And so it seems like given that, in terms of from the point of view of the universe, your kids don't matter more. But utilitarianism can make an account of why you should treat your kids as if they matter more, because you have special obligations, which utilitarianism can account for. There's a lot more to be said on this topic.
Yeah.
But
No, I mean, I totally agree. And like, this is one of the areas where the initially counterintuitive conclusion doesn't seem so unwelcome to me, where it's like, well, so you're saying that if utilitarianism is true, then I shouldn't buy my kid a PS5 and instead I should save someone's life. And it's like, well, maybe. Does that sound so crazy to you, actually? Like,
yeah. Right. I mean, and if we consider just comparing them directly, it just seems so obvious. So you bought your kid a PS5, and the way home from the store, you see a drowning child, and you can save them. Well, I mean, but you're like their PS4. It's like stuck deep in your pocket, so you'd have to wade into the water and ruin the PS4.
and
really
you had cargo shorts. The PS5.
Right, and you had a big fight with the store owner where the guy was like, "I'll sell you this PS4 one time to get the fuck out of my store, and I'm never letting you in my store again, so you won't be able to buy a PS4 in the future." Well, it seems like you should obviously save the drowning kid. What are you doing if you don't save the drowning kid? I mean, the technical term for the person who values a PS4 over the life of a drowning child is an asshole. And it doesn't matter, like, even if, and so, people who are dying of malaria are much like people who have the PS4. Sure, they're far away, but it wouldn't matter. Like, let's say you were seeing them on a projector screen, and you could like go down to the bottom of the lake and like press a button that would save them. Well, it doesn't matter that they're far away. What matters is that there's a life you can save at minimal cost to yourself. And so you should obviously do that.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of the Hunger Games, actually, like in the capital when, there's all this abundance, and then out in the districts there's all this like scarcity, and it's sort of like, we're like the people in the capital who are like, well, I want to spend my money to be surgically transformed into a cat boy or something, which seems to be what was going on in the capital. There was some weird things going on there, and then in like District 12 they don't have enough food or something. It's like, well, clearly that seems wrong, but I mean, that is kind of the situation we're in when we're buying PS5s instead of, helping people who don't have enough food when it's clearly within our power to do that.
Right. And the other thing is like, imagine, so, I mean, I'm not a Scanlonian, but imagine you had to like justify your decision to all the affected parties. So like, imagine if you would sound reasonable in this case, where you brought in the kid who's like on their deathbed dying of malaria, and you brought in your kid, and you're like, look, sorry, I had to save the PS4. Sorry, kid who's dying of malaria. I mean, like, if there was only one, if you had to speak to all the affected parties, you would just seem like such a horrible person. Like, I mean, that would just seem so terrible. But and so as a result of that, like, I think that if you only like, it's really unsurprising that we have the intuition that people around us matter more, because we just don't really have an emotional resonance with people who are far away. And yet, given that people who are far away don't like intrinsically matter a different amount, they matter for the same reason as the people who are near us matter.
Yeah, I just think there's a balance to be struck. Like, of course you can give preferential treatment to the people around you. Like, things would work better, all things considered, if we did that. Like, if we actually tried to interpersonally behave in a way that was totally impartial, I can't even imagine what that would look like.
Right. That's a reason why the way that the utilitarian act that's best will often be um, to like. I mean, utilitarianism has an account of why we have special obligation to those near us, given that forges important relationships. And you just couldn't go through life as a parent where you're just as saddened by the death of a kid 5 million miles away. I don't know if there are that. I don't know, a bunch of miles away.
Very far away. Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean.
Right.
But there are a couple questions I want to bring up before I forget. So as you said, as we were saying, there are some opponents of utilitarianism. There are some people who want children to die for PS5s. One of those people is John Buck, who is an opponent of utilitarianism, and he asked, "Does utilitarianism make the goodness, badness of an act extrinsic to the act itself? So one and the same act could go from being bad to good over time." I mean, wouldn't the answer be yes, because it's not like the action itself, it's the suffering that's caused or the pleasure that's caused that makes it right
Yeah.
or wrong?
No, I mean, of course. Like, so let's say that you murdered Hitler's grandmother. So, well, no. So, the rightness of the act would be, and technically, it wouldn't change over time, because it would always, like, if it'll always be the case that the act maximized well-being, right? But whether or not, so like, it may be that the benefits take a while to kick in. But that's just totally obvious. So like, if you uh, um, so if you like killed Hitler's grandmother, at first that would seem wrong, but that act would turn out to be right, assuming it would prevent the Holocaust, which is plausible. And so things can seem bad at first, but turn out to be good. That doesn't seem like an unintuitive implication.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has an argument. I have a bunch of tweets that are copy and pasted here, some questions that people had asked, and he has a particular argument. I think it's connected to this, so we'll come back to so since we're on the record now of saying that, like, yeah, we're answering in the way that I think he wants us to answer for his argument to work, but we'll have to come back to that later. So we'll have to put a pin in it now. But someone else asked, wouldn't a stone cold utilitarian just not make that promise to his dying friend? Well, I think the utilitarian would just say whatever would maximize well-being, and then just do the other thing.
I'm perfectly willing to grant that a utilitarian would plausibly not leave their fortunes to their kids, but instead save the lives of like hundreds of other people. That just seems like obviously the right thing to do. I mean, it seems like when we reflect on what's really important between like making sure your kids have money and making sure that hundreds of extra people live, it's just so much more important to make hundreds of extra people live.
So John is following up. He said, it's not that it seems bad at first, it's that it is bad and then it becomes good.
Well,
So
no,
I feel like that's connected to your thing about like, just our epistemic situation where, as far as we know, it seems bad, and then it turns out that it was good.
Well, no, so it wouldn't go from bad to good over time. It give it the same way that, like, let's say that you want to maximize money. Well, and let's say you give $100 to a random person, but then they become a billionaire and then give you $1 billion. It will always be the case that that action will maximize your total money, but that the time at which that action maximizes your money, it will always be the case that it will overall maximize your money, but there will be some points at which it'll be the case that it hasn't maximized your money yet. So in the utilitarian case, it's analogous. So for any act that's right, it'll always be the case that that act is right, but it could be the case that the right-making properties haven't happened yet. So it's still right given what will happen in the future.
Okay. So as for his original question, one and the same act could go from being bad to good over time?
Well, it sort of depends on what you mean by that, but not really. So it's like in the money case. The act, it'll always, whether or not an act will maximize your money won't change over time. But at a particular moment, it'll be true that the features of the act that make it maximize your money haven't happened yet.
I see. Okay, so we've got another super chat from John.
And just one other very brief point on that note. This just seems like true on all moral theories that are plausible. So let's say that you're like rude to someone. Well, that act would, it seems like that act would be, would seem bad at first. And for the short term, if you stipulated that the world ended 10 seconds from then it would be bad. But let's say that being rude to them delayed them, and so they didn't get into a car accident and die. The bad making features would go away and be replaced by good making features. So this just follows from any view that places any weight on utility, and we obviously have to place some weight on utility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Actually, he had another question that was not a super chat. What is the proper ratio of positive to negative utility to make an action morally permissible to perform?
What? There isn't one ratio. I mean, what you always have the most reason to do is the thing that maximizes the most well-being. How important it is to do something scales proportional to how much well-being it produces.
Yeah, just whatever produces the best outcome, just by virtue of like consequences and experiences, right? That would just be. But I mean, one interesting question here is like, what if it, so to go back to the antinatalism thing, like let's say that we knew because it was revealed to us by God that human life is kind of 50-50. It's like 50% good experiences, 50% bad experiences. Then would the utilitarian have to say, okay, I guess you can just flip a coin whether or not you want to be an antinatalist? Or would they say pleasure is more valuable than pain? Or would they say pain is like more weighty than pleasure? Like, I mean, what would happen if we found out it was 50-50 positive and negative utility?
I'd say it's a coin flip, given that, a life is 50%. Let's say that you say that lives on average have 100 units of well-being and 100 units of suffering. Well, 100 units of well-being are just defined as the amount of well-being that are precisely enough to offset 100 units of suffering.
So if it was a wash, which you think it would be if it was 50-50, then you flip a coin.
Well, do whatever you want.
Yeah, do whatever you want. I would rather be conscious. I think that consciousness is kind of like intrinsically good, where, I mean, obviously it can be outweighed if there's a ton of like negative utility, but if it's 50-50, I would say still it's better that consciousness exists than doesn't exist.
Well, yeah, I don't think that's true.
I think I'm incorporating some non-utilitarian ideas though to say that. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean that it seemed. I mean, I don't. Yeah, that does seem non-intuitive. But I mean, just consider the following thought
Or
experiment.
not non-intuitive, just non-utilitarian. If I'm saying
Yeah,
consciousness
sorry.
is just intrinsically good.
Yeah, I think that is non-utilitarian. But I mean, let's just imagine that like walls were conscious but didn't have any like well-being or suffering. They just sort of looked around. Does that really seem like it would be like a good thing?
Sorry, I was reading the next question.
Let's imagine that walls were conscious.
Mhm.
They had no happiness or suffering. They just sort of looked around as walls do, what they see when you're sleeping. Does that really seem like it would be good?
Well, let me ask you this. Would you rather die or just have all positive and negative utility removed from your life so you were just kind of this empty spirit? Like, would you rather die or just continue existing even though there wouldn't be any positive or negative valence to your experience?
Well, I don't care.
I would like to continue living, personally.
Um, okay, well, um, I need to think. I mean, I don't have the intuition that consciousness is intrinsically good, even absent positive experience. Um, uh, I mean,
You don't think it's like a good thing that consciousness exists, or it's just like valuable, I guess? Like the universe is more valuable because human beings exist.
no, and I think that intuition is plausibly the combination of given that your life is currently good, plausibly caused in some part by status quo bias, or given that your life is currently good, it seems like preserving life is good. Because in cases where it's like very much divorced from from keeping things similar-ish to how they are, intuition seems to go away. So let's imagine that after you died, you lived to the ripe old age of 95, you just lived for 100 extra years with no positive or negative experience. Does that seem like it would be a good thing?
I would rather not die. I mean, I don't. I
Okay.
mean, wait.
Or what?
Let me ask you about non-conscious things though, like or things that are typically taken to not be conscious. So like plants or things that are beautiful, even if no one's enjoying them. Like I feel like the universe is more valuable because there are like complex plants. Like if you're comparing two planets that are going to be destroyed, and there's no consciousness on either planet, but one planet has plant life and the other one doesn't, then I feel like the plant planet is more valuable.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I mean, so I think that, well, so okay, one counterexample of this is if you say that some plants are valuable, then an infinite number of plants would be infinitely valuable. And so then a world with infinite sentient plants would be worth a price worth paying for 10 at the cost of 100 quadrillion holocausts, if that seems implausible. Now you might try to reject aggregation in response to that. We're saying a lot of things that are only a little bit bad can't add up to one very bad thing, or a lot of things that are a little bit good can't add up to like things can't add up in that way. But I don't think that move works. So I mean, just and this can be illustrated by comparing tortures to dust specks. Well, you might say no number of dust specks can outweigh a torture. Well, but two tortures that are 90% as bad can outweigh one torture that's 100% as bad. Four that are 80% as bad can outweigh the two that are 90% as bad. 12 that are 70% as bad. That way, the few that are 100 the 80% is bad. And we can just keep going where we make it slightly less bad, but make it happen to more people until we get to the conclusion that some vast number of tortures that are only a teeny bit bad, only as bad as a pinprick, outweigh one vicious torture. And so I think that we have to accept that much like lots of grains of sand can amass in size to be bigger than Mount Everest collectively. Lots of things that are a little bit bad can amass in size can amass in badness to outweigh one thing that's really bad.
I mean, that seems like I actually am inclined to reject that. Where, I think that there's no like sort of like a Sorites thing. Like there's no one point where you say, okay, here's the exact moment along this continuum where a bunch of little negative things don't add up to this big negative thing. But I feel like at some point it has to happen, because there's no way that a bunch of like if you spread out a minor annoyance that lasts for 1 second over a trillion people, that doesn't add up to one horrific session of torture. Like the torture is worse than the supposedly equivalent thing, which is just a bunch of minor annoyances. So I just don't think that like
Okay.
like things sum up that way. So I don't really buy the like compensation idea. Like if you're
Okay. Do you accept that the principle that for any amount of suffering, making that suffering 95% is bad, and making it afflict 10 times as many people as is worse?
Yes.
Okay. Well, if you accept that, do you accept that if A is worse than B and B is worse than C, then A is worse than C?
Yes, but as I was saying, I feel like this is sort of a Sorites thing where it's like at some point it does change. Like I don't think it's as simple as like I think that like when we're incorporating these like massive amounts, like it is like on a continuum and there's no bright line, but still at some point you can't say that a bunch of minor annoyances. I mean, I would just say that like it should be clear that you went wrong somewhere if you're saying something like a minor annoyance for 1 million people for 1 second is equivalent to one torture. Like you've gone wrong somewhere if you're saying that.
I don't think that that's how the math would work out. But well, no. So if you accept those two principles that I gave, and there are lots of other good arguments for why enough suspects outweigh torture, which I'll get to in a moment. But if you accept that making it so that something, so that, just to be clear, you accept transitivity as a universal rule. So if one thing is worse than another thing, that other thing is worse than a third thing, and the first thing will always be worse than the third thing.
Right? Are you reading the comments on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Jeff. So wait, so do you accept that just the transitivity applies across the board? So if one thing's worse, if A, for anything, three things, if A is worse than B, B is worse than C, then A is worse than C.
Yeah.
Okay. And you accepted the previous principle. Well, it'll just follow from accepting those two principles that enough suspects outweigh torture. Because for any torture, start with one torture. Make it 95% as bad, afflict 10 people, that's worse. Make it 95% as bad as that, affect 100 people, that's worse. Make it 95% as bad as that, affect 1,000 people, that's worse. And so you can just keep going down this chain until you get it so that it continues to reduce in badness, let's say 1 million times, until you get some enormous numbers of dust specks, which outweigh a single torture. And so it just follows deductively from those two premises.
Yeah. No, I see the argument. I'm more confident that something has gone wrong than I am that like a bunch of dust specks are equivalent to one torture. Like it feels like that's sort of like a road sign that something has gone wrong, even though I don't know what it is.
Oh, it's not a Sorites paradox, because the point of Sorites paradoxes is that there's linguistic vagueness. I think that's the
Sorites is probably not the right thing to invoke there. No, I'll have to think more about it, because I don't see a problem. I don't see a problem with your argument. I just don't like the conclusion.
Right, there's just a like it can just be proved, like that if you accept those two things, then you have to accept the conclusion. And now I know that lots of people have the intuition that this is wrong, but this is exactly the type of intuition that we shouldn't trust. So as Humer points out in his paper In Defense of Repugnance, I know you're a big Humer fan, and whenever I want to appeal to the common sense man, I bring in Humer. So for one, humans are notoriously bad at like aggregating small things. So if you inform people of their risk of dying in a car accident per car ride, they're much less likely to be deterred than if you inform them of the chance of dying over the course of their life. People are very bad at figuring out how small things aggregate. So if you ask someone, let's say you took a piece of paper, folded it in half, and then folded it in half, and then folded it in half. You did that 50 times. How tall would it be? People are like, a few feet, and it would reach like to the moon or something.
Yeah.
And so our intuitions about these things are really unreliable. And our intuitions about really big things are also super unreliable. So we just have no understanding of we have no intuitive grasp of big numbers. So when you just combine all these really unreliable intuitions, it's no surprise that you would get very unreliable intuitions. And I think that there are lots of converging lines of evidence that show this conclusion is correct. And we can just make this more intuitive. So do you accept that some number of dust specks can outweigh a person breaking their bone?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay, so you think everyone in the U.S. getting a dust speck in their eye that irritates them for 5 seconds be less bad than one person breaking their bone?
Yeah.
Okay, and an infinite number of people getting dust specks in their eyes would be less bad than breaking a bone.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like you said, people don't really have reliable intuitions about really big numbers, so I feel like that's what's informing all the disagreement and confusion here.
Okay, do you accept that? How about rather than breaking a bone, how about it's spraining a bone, or like spraining a person's wrist?
Yeah, at some point, I'll see it your way.
Okay, well, or let's how about do you accept that some number of dust specks can outweigh being annoyed for 30 minutes? Let's say just being annoyed in traffic for 30 minutes. Okay,
Sure.
and do you accept that it would be worse if one person broke their bone than if everyone in the US was annoyed in traffic for an extra 30 minutes?
Dude, I already said I don't see a single problem with your argument. Like I already said, I think it.
So your resistance is just the appeal to emotion, logical fallacy?
Yeah, I was just saying, I feel like at some point I just want to like Morian shift and then just say like, well, maybe something has gone wrong here and I just don't know what it is. But it does seem like, I mean, practically speaking, because all this is like, never going to happen. But one area where it does seem kind of realistic is in morally compensating, so let's say that you're concerned with animal rights. So you give money to animal rights organizations every time that you like go get fast food or something because you feel bad about it. I mean, that seems like maybe that doesn't justify it. Like you give some money to an animal rights organization in order to feel better about eating animals or something. Plausibly, I think that doesn't actually like, set the scales right.
Well, I disagree with that. But before we get into that, just one more brief point about the organ harvesting case. Well, if you really held that that small things like the harm of missing out on getting ice cream is not worth the torture. Well, if you get that to get ice cream, you plausibly increase your risk of getting kidnapped and tortured. This would seem to entail that you should not do trivial things for fun if they slightly increase your risk of death, of torture and death.
I don't know. Sorry, say that one more time.
So if you think that a torture is infinitely worse than missing out on small pleasures like getting ice cream, well then you shouldn't go out and get ice cream because it's plausible that marginally increases your risk of torture and death.
I don't know. I feel like I keep getting owned with my own logic. I don't know. I said it's infinite.
This is what happens.
I don't think it's infinite. See, this is where I feel like I'm just invoking non-utilitarian things, and then you're sort of translating it like, oh, well, you said it's infinitely bad. It's like, I don't think it's infinitely bad. I just think that it's impermissible.
No, I didn't say that it's infinitely. I didn't say that you said that it's infinitely bad. I said that you said that it was infinitely worse than dust specks, which would presumably mean that it's infinitely worse than like missing out on ice cream.
I just don't think bad experiences sum up like that.
Okay, so let's say that you were making a choice between, so you choose to either prevent several billion people from getting a speck of, or from like going out and having fun for the night, or you can prevent one torture.
I guess I would prevent people from having fun for one night.
Okay, and do you accept that when people go out and have fun, that they plausibly increase their risk of getting tortured, of like going to the bar and getting kidnapped, for example?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
sure.
So if you knew that at the cost that a torture was the cost of everyone in the U.S. going out and having fun, then you would ban everyone in the U.S. from going out and having fun, given that prevents one torture. So you think it should be illegal to have fun.
Okay, well, now that I've been roundly owned with my own logic and debunked, I have to bring up a couple more chats. Jeff said, I was going to do a super chat, but I decided to donate the money to charity instead. Well, actually, Jeff, what you don't realize is that I'm going to drown a child in a pond for every person who doesn't give me a super chat. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, Jeff, I agree with your decision. I think instead of giving money to Emerson, you should donate it to the Against Malaria Foundation. Though I think that the second best use of your money is giving money to Emerson. So if you don't care about malaria kids, then give it to Emerson. Well, actually, give it to the Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions Patreon.
And there was another super chat from John. Thank you, John. Does utilitarianism do violence to our intuition that it's always wrong to torture a child for fun? I mean, it seems like yes and no, depending on. I mean, because you included the motivation there. Like, does utilitarianism do violence to our intuition that it's always wrong to torture a child for fun? Well, in one obvious sense, yes, because there's nothing that's like intrinsically impermissible or like always wrong or something on utilitarianism. But if you're bringing about great harm to a child for relatively trivial reasons, like it's just kind of fun to you, then utilitarianism would not permit that kind of thing. But I mean, clearly, I mean, on utilitarianism, there is nothing that's like intrinsically impermissible.
Well,
Like
no,
it
what
could be
John
right to
Buck is
torture a
saying.
baby.
Well, what John Buck is saying is that if you got enough pleasure from torturing a baby,
Yeah,
then
like a utility monster situation. Like if you got immense pleasure from torturing a child, then would it be
right?
okay on utilitarianism?
Yeah, I have a 30-minute podcast about the utility monster. To obviously feed the utility monster. But so I think that any answer we give here will do violence to our intuition. So let's imagine that you say that pleasure derived from torturing a child is actively bad, such that the world is a better place if you don't derive pleasure from torturing a child. Well, if you hold, so given the aggregation point that I previously argued that I completely owned Emerson on before, um, given that, so if X is good or if X is bad, then it'll have to aggregate to be a bad thing, which would mean that the implication of the alternative view, which says that it's bad when a person derives pleasure from torturing a child, so that if you could either choose a world where someone tortures a child and has no pleasure, or someone tortures a child and has pleasure, is that you should torture a child to prevent someone else who's torturing a child from getting immense pleasure from it. And so in both cases, we all agree that you should torture a child to change the well-being of, to change the pleasure of someone who's torturing a child by plus or minus some vast amount. We just think that it's plus some vast amount. You think that it's minus some vast amount. And so I think that that'll follow from the view. The other point is, we just obviously don't have reliable intuitions about that case, given that it's just impossible to psychologically imagine a case like how much pleasure could ever outweigh a torture. But if we just think about like let's imagine that in order to have fun for a night, you had to inflict like a small amount of suffering on a baby. So you had to give them like a light slap where it wouldn't harm them, but it would just cause them to be in a little bit of pain for a minute. And that was the only way to have fun for several hours. Well, that seems like that would be worth it, possibly. And so this just involves scaling that up, right? And so, yeah, so we all agree that you should torture children to change the fun in some direction. We just think that it should be to have fun. And it's also there's a plausible there's a very plausible story to be told about why we would have the intuition, even if it were wrong. If something turns out to be bad every time in the real world, but then if you rig up some hypothetical agent that can experience 1,000,000 times more pleasure than any real world agent, it's not surprising that our intuitions about that would be unreliable. And so, the only real way to support this intuition is by saying that sadistic pleasures don't make you well off. Now, I think that the accountant says that it's actually actively bad to derive sadistic pleasure from the suffering of another person. I think that's wrong for the reasons I described above, that it gets you the opposite problem. But if you say that it's just neutral, that we don't care about how much pleasure a person's having, well, then you get this sharp cutoff where it depends on exactly what you're doing, but there's this sharp cutoff where things go from being slightly good to not good at all. So that if you have the pleasure of the type that's below the threshold, that doesn't matter at all, but above the threshold, that matters. So that infinite pleasure below the threshold is less valuable than one unit of pleasure, a scintilla above the threshold. The final point I'd make on this is that Actually, it seems
Okay,
there.
yeah, I have something to say about the utility monster situation. So, like, a lot of people think that that the answer is just totally obvious. You shouldn't torture a baby for fun, and I agree with them. I can't really imagine like any circumstance where it would be justified to, like, I think there are kind of intrinsically impermissible things, which definitely puts some distance between me and utilitarians. Like, there are some things that are just, for instance, like God would not be allowed to permit, if it was within his power, to not to prevent them or something. And arguably a few of those things have happened on Earth. But I will say that the utility monster thing does kind of annoy me sometimes, because people get kind of indignant. They're just like, oh, I don't know. I just feel like it's this self-righteous delusion where, they're not vegans. Like, they do sort of like, they're sort of like real life utility monsters where, they're all mad at utilitarians, or they're saying like, utilitarianism leads to this or that absurdity. And it's like, you actually do, participate in the system that involves horrific suffering, horrific torture of animals, for like on a scale that we can barely comprehend, for completely trivial pleasure, that we really don't need. And it's just like, the utility monster thing. It's like a lot of the people, a lot of like human beings are kind of like utility monsters, except they don't even have like the justification of like, you can't even imagine like how pleasurable this is. Like, if you had God's point of view, you might actually think maybe this is justified. Like, no, you're inflicting intense amounts of suffering on animals for completely trivial reasons. And then you turn around and then get self-righteous and indignant about some of these hypothetical cases where utilitarians are seemingly committed to weird things.
Right. I think that the way that we think about, so one of the many objection or reasons I give for why we should accept a utility monster is that we frequently act like utility monsters to insects, and that doesn't seem wrong. It seems like an insect's really annoying us, we can kill it, and it doesn't really matter. Well, the difference between us and the utility monster is like orders of magnitude greater than the difference between us and insects. So, and then another point is, let's imagine, rather than a positive utility monster, a negative utility monster. So they are experiencing horrific agony, like just unimaginably terrible agony. And the only way to lessen their agony is to like let them eat a person. Well, in that case, like if their agony is just so immense, they're experiencing way, way, way worse than torture every second that they don't eat a person. Which it seems really obvious that in that case, that they should be allowed to eat a person.
I don't know. I mean, I don't really have intuitions about some of these cases that you're bringing up. Like, a couple of people in the chat said normative ethics is so goofy because of thought experiments like this. And, I kind of agree, where it's like, this does seem so divorced from like the moral intuitions we have. It's like, why would I trust what I think about like the kind of situation, the negative utility monster situation?
But remember, these are the cases that are being used to reject utilitarianism.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, we're talking about really abstract systems that make general claims, and like we're trying to come up with counterexamples to those general claims, which is all that. I mean, this is not really connected to, applied ethics or like informing our action. I mean, not really. But someone else asked, my friend says that no one, hang on one second. My friend says that no one moral theory is correct. We have to use different reasoning in different situations. Do you agree with that idea? Yes. Your friend sounds like a very wise person.
Yeah, so I disagree about the wisdom of your friend. Well, so one cost, one like very large cost of saying that there's no one moral theory that's true across the board is just simplicity. I mean, if there's no simple moral rule, then that requires an infinitely complex moral system. And yet, an infinitely complex moral system sacrifices all of the parsimony. So if parsimony is a virtue at all, which I think it is, then making it an infinitely complex system is going to be better. And the reason why people want to, reject utilitarianism is because they'll find that it's unintuitive sometimes. But your intuitions are not 100% reliable. And so on the hypothesis that utilitarianism were correct, we'd expect it to diverge from utilitarianism somewhat. So the few cases where it does is no evidence against utilitarianism. And especially when, every time when utilitarianism diverges from our intuition, and we really reflect, it turns out that the utilitarians have a point. Remember, call back to a few minutes ago when I was owning Emerson about the torture versus death specs case. If it turns out that there are good arguments that will own the non-utilitarians on all the alleged counterexamples, which I think there are, that's just really good evidence for utilitarianism. So
there's okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so just very briefly, with other theories that are wrong, like natural law theory, or like the radical libertarian idea that you shouldn't steal a penny from Jeff Bezos even to prevent infinite torture. When you ask them to justify their crazy judgments, they'll just say, well, it's what the theory says. Well, with utilitarianism, every time there are like 10 good arguments for accepting what the utilitarian said. I've written like 20,000, like 10,000 words about the utility monster. And there were just a bunch of really good arguments for why we should accept it.
I did want to touch on one other case from Humer's book really quick, called The Electrical Accident. Are you familiar with the electrical accident?
Is it the one that came from Scanlon originally about the guys tangled up in the wires to watch a sports game?
Yeah. So here, let me read it. Joan has had an accident and has gotten caught in some electrical equipment at a television station. He's currently suffering painful electrical shocks. In order to rescue him, you would have to turn off the TV station's transmitter for 15 minutes. This will relieve Jones's pain, but will also interrupt the broadcast of the World Cup, which a large number of people are watching, thus causing a diminution in the entertainment for many people. Alternatively, you could wait until the broadcast is over, in which case Jones will suffer great pain for the next hour, but no one will have their entertainment interrupted. There are so many people watching that the total decrease in welfare from interrupting the broadcast would be greater than the decrease in welfare suffered by Jones if he remains trapped. So should you rescue Jones now or wait for the game to finish?
Yeah, so one relevant point is that I think that if we do the math, it'll turn out that there are not enough people on Earth for Jones's action to be bad. But so now let's imagine. But so to make it the case, we have to imagine that there are quadrillions of people who are all watching the same sports game.
I mean, I don't. How is that even motivated though? You're saying that there aren't. Well, it would have to be quadrillions of people. You don't think that it could be 1 million or 2 million people?
So the number of hours there are in a human lifetime. Wait, let's see. Hours in 70 years. There are about 613,000 hours. Or so let's say. So that'll be 6 million. Okay, let's say people watch for an hour. Well, if we say that watching a sports game is, let's say, twice as good as average, then it's still going to have to require. No, I guess there would be. So if there were maybe 3 million people, but it seems like being viciously tortured for an hour is worse than death. So I don't know. It would depend on how the math worked out, but which is always the utilitarian answer. But that's sort of a side point. But I think that we should accept the judgment. So we can apply a similar method to the one applied to the torture versus death specs case. So suppose that we compare Jones' situation to two people experiencing painful electric shocks. It would surely be better to prevent the shock to the two people. Now compare each of those to two more shocks, which are 60% as painful as Jones' original one. Surely the 4 shocks are worse than 2. We can keep doing this process until it's reduced to a large number of barely painful shocks. So just equivalent to just some vast number of people, I don't know, the gum thing that looks like gum, but you pull it, it gives you a small electric shock. But if we're choosing, a bunch of people experiencing teeny electric shocks that are only barely painful for way more people to watch a sports game, seems worth it. And so, we can just keep bidding down the bad things until it's a very bad thing is less bad than a vast number of things that are slightly bad. But it seems like a vast number of things that are good can clearly outweigh a vast number of things that are slightly bad. And so that's one point. Additionally,
it just seems like you are committed based on what you just said and the grains of sand thing. It seems like you are committed to just letting that guy be electrically shocked until the game.
Yeah, no, I well, I mean, there would. I think that in real world sports games, it wouldn't work out to be that way. But in a case like if there were like let's maybe that would work out that way.
Why not, man? I think it would. People go absolutely nuts for certain games. Like if it was the right game, then it could totally
Yeah, I
work
think
out. That
yeah, I think that it would plausibly work that way for like for like the Super Bowl.
Yeah, but this is exactly what I'm saying, where it's like I'm just like Morian shifting here, sure, but like, and I don't actually see what's wrong with the argument that you were making, but I know I shouldn't let that guy be electrically shocked, even if it's like during the Super Bowl and it's like the best game ever. Like I'm more confident that that's the case than I am that you're making a good argument, even though I actually can't see what's wrong with your argument.
But your intuition in this case is the type of intuition that you shouldn't trust. So we know that humans are bad at adding up lots of small things, and we know that humans are bad at evaluating lots of big things. And so now you're comparing two things that we know that we're intuitively very bad at evaluating. And you're trusting your intuition about that when we know that there are cases like the repugnant conclusion where our intuitions in very similar domains go awry, especially because there are lots of other arguments for why you should let Jones be tortured. So one of them is that if we just say that like something really bad, like a person being tortured for an hour, let's say that that's roughly as bad as a person dying. That seems plausible. Jones doesn't get killed. Well, sports games plausibly if some sports team has a sports game, that'll kill some people. So some people while they're driving to the sports game, at least one person will get into a lethal accident. So that would just seem to ban sports games. I mean, the risk, if it affects a person at random, the risk of being the risk of dying in a car accident is much greater than the risk of for any given person being tortured. Yet it seems like a sports game is possibly worth is worth having even despite the risk of car accidents, and so it would in turn be worth having even if it required one extra torture. Look, I mean, Jones just needs to take one for the team. I'm sorry. Now, I'm sorry. I keep feeling like as you want to move on, I have a last point to make, but sorry about that. But just one point is maybe you think I'm wrong about this, and you think I'm sort of off the rails. I obviously don't. But the relevant moral implications of utilitarianism are things that all plausible moral theories will agree with. That like the relevant like implications for how you should live your life. So, the main ways that your life will change if you become a utilitarian are you'll plausibly like give more money to effective charities, and yet all plausible moral views hold that you should give money to effective charities. So you don't have to be on board with these weird, crazy utilitarian judgments in order to think that basically like the things that utilitarians say, the way that utilitarians would say that you should live your life differently by looking into effective altruism, giving money to effective organizations, not paying for animals to be raped, tortured, and murdered in factory farms. Those are things that all plausible moral theories will hold. So you don't have to hold these crazy results. Michael Huemer even says that that he thinks that that it's possibly a good thing to make more people utilitarians, because utilitarians never really act on these crazy principles. There's never a case where you're in fact torturing Jones, and so it's just better if more people feel like they should give money to effective charities and save a bunch of lives.
Right. Yeah, and I mean we touched on this with some of the other cases with well, first of all, there are the historical cases where utilitarians do seem to be more likely to arrive at a better answer. But secondly, there's just, with a lot of these thought experiments and stuff, when we're just trying to work out the correct normative theory, like they're not really tuned to, real world cases, so it's like we're never going to find ourselves in this kind of situation. We're just trying to figure out if we have like an adequate analysis of what makes something right or wrong, but our intuitions are attuned to real world cases, and in the real world, removing vital organs involuntarily or murdering fat men who happen to be standing near trolley tracks would normally have overall bad consequences. And in the hypothetical scenarios, it's just stipulated that the normal rules don't apply. So those actions like involuntary organ harvesting have net good consequences. But in our minds, for some reason, we still react negatively because those types of actions would obviously be bad in the real world by utilitarian standards. You don't have to anyway.
Right.
However, I do think with the Jones case, I feel like that is actually the case with the electrical thing. That does seem like a genuine case where the right thing to do is not the thing that maximizes, pleasure and minimizes harm.
Yeah, well, I disagree for the arguments that I gave.
Well, I think that you're just saying that it doesn't add up right, but I think it plausibly does add up right.
Well, no, but I'm perfectly willing to bite the bullet on like at the Super Bowl that you should do it. I think that you shouldn't do it for like average sports games.
Okay. So is it? I was going to ask you something based on what you just said, though. There are two things based on what you just said that I wanted to ask. The first one has to do with, is it best to teach utilitarianism, which you seem to, I mean, obviously it seems like by utilitarian standards, it might be the wrong thing to teach utilitarianism, but, as Humer said, like, the world would probably become a better place if more people became utilitarians than are currently utilitarians.
No, I don't know why by utilitarian standards it would be that. I think it would be very good to teach people utilitarianism.
Well, it could be. It could hypothetically be the utilitarian thing to not teach utilitarianism.
It could in theory, but I think that if you just look at the real world, like utilitarians are out doing great things, combating factory farming, trying to safeguard the future. I mean, like 75% of effective altruists, and I think effective altruism is the most important social movement. It saved hundreds of thousands of lives. 75% of those people are utilitarians, and it seems like there's strong correlation between being a utilitarian and being interested in effective altruism. I mean, people like Peter Singer do way more good than most philosophers.
Than any of his hysterical critics who are like absolutely losing their mind about practically nothing.
Yeah, no. I agree with that. And Richard Chappell wrote a blog post about this called "Is Non-Consequentialism Self-Effacing?" where he was like, even if you're not a consequentialist, it seems like what you should do, assuming you think it's good in general when people make the world better, is you should try to get people to be utilitarians. Because maybe you shouldn't lie to them if you're that kind of non-consequentialist, but you should at least be like, read utilitarian literature, read Benthams.blogspot.com. Because that'll make people better people. Like utilitarians just tend to like be more charitable than non-utilitarians.
Yeah, I do have one devastating objection though to utilitarianism that was raised by a philosopher a long time ago. Her name was Ayn Rand, and she was one of the world's greatest thinkers. And she said that utilitarianism implies that if 51% of the population votes to enslave the other 49%, then you have to go along with it. So how do you answer that?
Yeah,
can you answer that?
Yeah, so this is a typical Ayn Rand move of just being like just disastrously wrong and not knowing what the hell she's talking about. Utilitarianism is not merely about benefiting the majority. If the harms of the minority outweigh the benefits of the majority, then it wouldn't be justified. And the harms of slavery obviously outweigh the benefits from slavery. So no. No,
I agree. I think it's been debunked. So Cube Dude 76 asks, suppose most people think shoving the fat man is morally wrong. Could there be enough onlookers experiencing horror at you doing the moral thing, pushing him, to make it immoral? Well, I don't think it would be moral to push him, but I think Matthew probably would.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't think in the real world you should push him, given that, I mean, that would be illegal, and so then I'd go to jail, and then I couldn't make money and donate to effective works. So,
right.
So like, in terms of saving the most lives, the best way of doing that is just like for utilitarian generally to avoid legal jeopardy. And utilitarians can save hundreds of lives over the course of their lifetime. The cost to save a life is like $4,000. So if you predict that going to jail would decrease your future earnings or your ability to donate by more than a few $1,000s. But if it could be the case, but let's imagine that there's no legal jeopardy, and yeah, it could be the case if a billion people would be distraught by it. Yeah, then sure, that would flip the judgment.
So I asked this on Twitter, and if people had any questions for us, and there were a few that came in. One of them is basically the sort of cookie objection that I've heard from humor. Like, if you've got a cookie and you can give it to a really bad person, or you can give it to a really good person, utilitarianism seems to imply that you should either be impartial, or if it so happens that the really bad person is going to get like slightly more pleasure from the cookie, then you should give it to the bad person because they're going to get slightly more pleasure from it than the good person. Even though most people intuitively would think you give the cookie to the good person, even if it's not as pleasurable for them to eat it.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that is that I really think that when we just think more about this case, like I don't really have an intuition that it's like significantly more important to like give a cookie to a good person than a bad person. I mean, maybe I think that I don't really have that intuition. But so holding this, one would have to be some type of retributivist, or I mean, not necessarily goes. Excuse me. Not necessarily goes.
Your computer screen froze for a second. I was wondering what was happening, and then you started sneezing. Okay. Bless you.
It didn't freeze. I froze. But yeah. So I don't really have the intuition that there is a big difference. But so I wrote a blog post about this. Where I think it was Contra Humor and Utilitarianism Part 6.
Part 6?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a 10-part series in response to humor.
Oh, okay.
Why I'm not a utilitarian. So I think that retributivism, which holds that, I'm using retributivism broadly to refer to the notion that how important it is to benefit people scales in proportional to how virtuous they are. So it could include the notion that it's actively good to punish bad people, or it could just hold that it's less important to benefit bad people. So one, I think utilitarianism can give a pragmatic account of why it makes sense to send people to jail, give worse treatment to serial killers, etc. But no, now this question boils down to whether retributivism makes sense. And I think that retributivism runs into a lot of problems. So let's say that you hold that it's intrinsically good when bad people suffer. Well, then you would have to hold that it would just be good to create horrible people to suffer. And yet that obviously seems bad.
Clearly you haven't met the Calvinist God.
Right. And so now they might say that it's just less important for bad people to experience well-being. But if they say that it's just less important for bad people to experience well-being, well, so they can either hold that it's still good when bad people experience well-being, or they can hold that if a person is sufficiently bad, just their well-being and suffering no longer matters. Well, maybe their suffering matters beyond a certain point, but their well-being doesn't matter. So let's take the first case. Well, if they say that their well-being still matters, then if the cookie is sufficiently tasty, then it's better to give it to Ted Bundy than Mother Teresa. And so we all agree, well, given that I'll argue the other two options are untenable, we all agree that you should give it if the cookie is tasty enough. And so now you're just disagreeing about how tasty the cookie has to be worth giving to Ted Bundy over Mother Teresa. But so now let's say that you say that it just doesn't matter if someone like Ted Bundy is well off. Well, you got this weird categorical jump where there's some point at which it matters that it's a person well off. So like, let's say that you set the threshold at being like as bad as like a person who beats people up. Well, then you would say that that giving enough cookies to that person would be better than giving the one cookie to Ted Bundy. Than the one cookie to Mother Teresa, or giving them a cookie that they enjoy enough be better than giving the one cookie to Mother Teresa. But additionally, that runs into the problem that, so you get this weird categorical threshold where two people who have very, very similar levels of virtue, for one of them it's good when they are well off, and for one of them it's not good at all. And so these two people are almost identical in how virtuous they are. But for one of them, if you give them one cookie that they enjoy, that would be better than if the other person lives an extra 80 years and is super happy. Yeah, that seems unintuitive.
I gotta say, when you invoke things like that, I don't have intuitions. Like, at least at first blush, like when you say,
you don't
like,
have intuition.
Well, when we're comparing a cookie to a grain of speck in your eye, or a speck in your eye, then you have to compare that to living 80 years longer, or if we frame 5 people, and that's very counterintuitive. It's like, I don't know what that. I literally don't have an intuition of that.
Well, no. We'll think about the case. So the case is these two people are almost equally.
I will
virtuous.
not think about the case. But I did want to say one thing though, because I'm actually agreeing with something crucial about what you're saying, which is that, well, first of all, the Mother Teresa Ted Bundy thing. It's like, do you want to give a cookie to someone who greatly increased the amount of suffering in the world, or do you want to give it to Ted Bundy? And that's a really complicated question. But I do kind of side with humor on that point. But I also think that this is actually one of those cases where the world would get better if people thought more like utilitarians, because I'm thinking about like our prison system, which is horribly retributive, where no one cares that there's all this like, torture and rape and, physical pain and stuff. But then you go to, Nordic countries where, prison looks as nice as my apartment basically, or like, they have like video games and stuff, and it makes people so angry. And it's like, well, first of all, that leads to better consequences overall for like social health. But also, I don't think it's good that we have a prison system where people are like anally raped. Like I actually think that that's bad. So I think the kind of sentiment that you're expressing here about, contra the cookie example, like, yeah, actually, I think it would be better if more people thought like utilitarians in this area. Like, I think it would actually improve the world, especially in this country, like quite a bit.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Another point is so Emerson, you and I obviously disagree with this, but I don't believe in free will. So and if one doesn't believe in free will, then retributivism ceases to make sense. And I think even if one's a compatibilist, retributivism makes less sense. If what you do is fully determined by previous physical causes in the universe, well then it seems strange to that you would deserve to suffer. I also think that there isn't a good criteria for bad person. So let's say that you say bad person is a person who caused a lot of harm. Let's imagine it turned out that some politician ended up causing a lot of harm, but was like really well intentioned. Well, it wouldn't seem like they're a bad person. And so maybe you say that it's like intending to cause a lot of harm, but then that doesn't really capture that it's intending to do something morally wrong. Well, but that doesn't really capture our intuition, because even if like Hitler thought what he was doing was right, it seems like it wouldn't be a good model of retributivism if it involves saying that Hitler is like morally off the hook. And so there are a variety of different accounts that can be given. I can't describe all of them in detail right now, but I don't think that there's any satisfactory account. And I also think that retributivist accounts have trouble accounting for how our virtue changes over time. So people. So let's imagine that so if you say that it's more important to have benefits if you're a better person, then let's imagine you knew that you were going to go to a lecture by Derek Parfit, and Derek Parfit, great philosopher, he was going to make you a more moral person. He predicted you'd come out of it more moral. You can either eat the cookie before or after. Well, it seems like this would say that even if you'd enjoy the cookie less after, because it would be like stale or whatever, you should eat it after just because you're a better person after that. And yet that seems like a weird implication. You should like budget your happiness so that you have it when you're feeling most virtuous. Like that seems like a pretty strange implication. And then you get into weird things with like, let's imagine that a person turned evil for 5 minutes every day. How does that happen? And so the accounts get very complicated. But I don't think that there's a satisfactory reply. And then last point on this, I think that it can't account for how contingent our actions are on physical states of affairs. So let's imagine someone's a serial killer, but we know that the person will only be a serial killer if there's lead in their water. and we can press a button that will, well, then it seems strange to say, okay, this kid, they deserve to suffer only if there's lead in their water. And if not, they don't deserve to suffer. It seems strange to hold whether a person deserves to suffer, rather deserves to feel pleasure less. It seems very strange to hold that hostage to like physical things, like whether there's lead in water. We know that the physical affects the mental, which means anti-physicalism is debunked.
Here, we should have a palate cleanser before we. There's one other question that someone asked that that I wanted to cover, which is sort of related to many questions that people asked. But first, what's your favorite board game? Everyone's brain has been fried by all these utilitarian thought experiments, so we need to change the subject.
I like. I enjoy Agricola. That's a fun game.
Oh yeah.
Does chess count as a board game? Like it has a board.
Are you talking about the Queen's Gambit board game?
No, it's talking about chess.
What is that?
Okay.
I like Ticket to Ride.
Oh, I also enjoy Ticket to Ride. Well,
I'm really bad at it. I lose literally every single time, but I enjoy it.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my board game stack over there. I have this one game called Blockbuster that's actually really fun. It's like a movie themed game. And I always win because my wife doesn't know anything about movies. And
wow.
Yeah.
That seems really intellectually satisfying.
Oh yeah. No, I make her play it all the time just because I like winning. No, yeah. But yeah, just one funny story there.
That's very good.
I was just saying one funny story there. She was given a prompt to name a movie with like a lizard in it. So like the way the game works is you at one stage of the game you have to like there will be a prompt like name a movie with like a vampire or something, and then you name one, you like hit the buzzer, and then the other person names one, they hit it, and then it's like a timer, and if you can't think of one, then you lose that round. And it was something like name a movie with a giant lizard, and so I just said Godzilla, and then it went to her turn, and she said Geico, which is not a movie, it's not a TV show, but it's not really even a commercial. It's actually an insurance company that has commercials with a Geico with a gecko in it, which is just like so incredibly far off from naming a movie with a lizard. But I was literally like on the floor because it's like the prompt was name a movie with a lizard in it, and then she said Geico, which is an insurance company. Anyway,
the Geico movie. Yep. I agreed with Gerard Dastine that if Ayn Rand makes a claim about a philosopher or a philosophical stance, it's probably a false claim. One of the funnier things I've read is Michael Huemer writing about Ayn Rand. And Michael Huemer is a big libertarian, as is Ayn Rand. But he was just like he was just going through like line by line of like all the arguments she was making, and like they just made no sense. They all were just total non sequiturs.
Yeah. No, I mean, especially since she refused to learn anything about philosophy. But there was this one guy, I can't remember what his name is, but he was around like in the 70s, but he like translated all of Ayn Rand's stuff into like philosophy speak so philosophers could at least understand what she was saying, because she like so frequently misused terms, like so frequently was just not operating within the framework of like everyone else that no one even knew what she was saying. And there's this guy whose name I can't remember who like translated it, and I remember listening to some because I know a couple people who are objectivists, but anyway, yeah, she was just an awful philosopher, an awful woman.
Yeah, I have some blog post titled something along the lines of like Ayn Rand is batshit insane, I think.
Yeah. We have a really good point from John, which is that the gecko is also a normal sized. The gecko is also a normal sized lizard, so it's wrong on so many counts. Anyway.
Wow. This feels like when people are like you should reject the repugnant conclusion. There are like a dozen reasons why they're wrong. It feels like the repugnant conclusion is like similar. There are like a bunch of converging lines of evidence about why it's wrong, just like the gecko case.
Okay, so one more question. from Baxter Williams, and this actually relates to a lot of questions that came up. This is sort of like, I mean, it's sort of like an epistemic question, but it's a practical question about how to resolve disagreement and how to figure out like what to actually do. So, does Matthew have a formula for utility? How does one use utilitarianism in a practical example to decide a course of action, or is it more that a utilitarian world best lines up with the decisions we already make as opposed to other ethical frameworks? So do you have like a formula for figuring out? And like there were a couple questions in the chat that were like, well, how would you adjudicate this situation? Like how would you possibly measure the utility and come to a decision?
I mean, things get complicated, but I mean, I think that the way that you would reason about, for example, about lots of questions is just very similar to the way that you normally do, but you just take everyone's interest into account. So take the example of like, going to college. So one of the things that matters is cost. Will it make it so that you can donate less in the future as a result of its cost? Will it make it so that you're more likely to do well in terms of your career, so you'll be able to donate more money in the future? Will you enjoy it? Will other people enjoy your presence? When it comes to politics, I mean, I think that it just very well matches how we reason about. Well, I mean, the way that we reason about politics generally involves ignoring animals or people in other countries. But so it would be sort of like that, but not ignoring animals or people in other countries. So like, when we're deciding whether or not to put on sanctions, well, sanctions kill a lot of people. Are the benefits worth it? Well, I didn't think so, but I mean, just the way that we reason, we just see the things that the ways in which things benefit people or sentient beings, ways in which they harm sentient beings, and we just compare them. There's no magical formula, but we wouldn't expect the correct moral view give us a magical formula for solving all moral questions easily. The world is too complicated for simple cheat sheet codes that allow us to solve all politics without getting into the nitty-gritty empirical details.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, I mean, resolving disagreements between utilitarians, like, yeah, that's a problem, but it's also a problem in every other area of life. It's not like it's a unique problem for utilitarians. If you subscribe to some other normative theory, you're going to run into the same exact problem. But yeah, and I think that a lot of apparently moral disagreements are really just disagreements about descriptive facts, and obviously there's a fact of the matter about, what is the case in the, just in the physical world or something. But a lot of moral disagreements come down to disagreements over descriptive claims, and no one thinks that those are, that like undermines some kind of theory of the external world or something. But yeah, I mean, it can be hard in practice to resolve disagreements, but I don't think that really counts as a serious strike against utilitarianism any more than it would for, virtue ethicists. But also a lot of the moral disagreement and a lot of the calculating that utilitarians would have to do, it does come down to like, descriptive facts of the matter, like if you actually believed, like the Aztecs believed, that the sun would blink out of existence if we stopped sacrificing people, and that the victims of sacrifice would go to a better afterlife than the people who weren't sacrificed, then the thing is, we would do it too. Like if we sincerely believe that the sun is going to burn out if we don't sacrifice someone, that's not really a moral disagreement. That's a disagreement about just descriptive statements. Is it the case that the sun will burn out if we don't sacrifice someone? And is it the case that the soul of the sacrificial victim will get a better life, in the hereafter? It's like, those are not moral disagreements. Those are just like straightforward factual disagreements, non-normative factual disagreements. And yeah, anyway, I think some people offer, objections to utilitarianism that kind of prove too much.
Yep. I agree. Objections to utilitarianism are shit. Utilitarianism is correct.
Well, I think that's that's obviously not it, because you've got a currently 300-page book that you're not done with, and you've got a blog with why utilitarianism is true, part 575. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that people can follow up on if they want to continue debating utilitarianism with you. Because believe me, I can tell everyone listening to this now or later, Matthew has endless energy for defending utilitarianism against anyone who would dare criticize it. So if you want to debate utilitarianism with Matthew and you're not crazy, then I'm sure he would have you on his channel to do so.
I would actually have you on my channel, even if you are crazy.
You have had a couple crazy people on your channel.
with facts and logic. Yeah.
But yeah, benthamsbulldog.substack, Deliberation under Ideal Conditions on YouTube. Is there anything else that you wanted to plug?
Sorry,
or say
just to be clear, that it's benthams.substack.com.
Benthams.substack. Okay, well, it's linked in the description anyway, so people can just click on that.
Well, one thing, I just want to present just sort of a brief way of like the sort of intuitive basis for utilitarianism. So like, it seems like morality is about what we would do if we were fully rational and impartial. It seems like when you say someone's being immoral, what you mean is some combination of you care about the wrong things or you don't care about everyone. And so utilitarianism is just, and so it seems like any way that you make us irrational, fully rational and impartial, it would make us utilitarian. So one way of doing that is by having us be behind the veil of ignorance, where we don't know who we are going to be. So we don't know if we're going to be, so we're equally likely to be everyone. Well, if we were from behind the veil of ignorance, if you were equally likely to be everyone, then you would maximize overall utility, given that you would value a 1/2 chance of 2 utility at equal to a certainty of 1 utility, given that 2 utility is just the amount to find such that a 1/2 chance of it is just as good as certainty of 1 utility. Or another way of doing it is making it so that you're not behind the veil of ignorance, but you just live everyone's life. So you first live your own life, then you live the life of every other human on Earth. And it seems like utilitarianism is just act as if you lived everyone's life, and then you were just doing what makes what you would rationally do self-interestedly if you lived everyone's life. That seems to capture the impartiality and rationality aspect of morality. Well, that was a hell of a sentence. The impartiality and rationality aspect of morality, and that just seems to get us to utilitarianism. Assuming and then maybe we're hedonists or desire theorists or something. Now, just the final point. Now, for the veil of ignorance thing, you may say that we maximize average utility rather than total utility, but that's only if we don't take into account merely possible people. And I think that the notion that we should act, and so I think that we should take into account possible people, given that, well, one, it just seems intuitive, but also average utilitarianism is crazy. And let this be the note that I'll end things on, just bashing a random alternative view. So if average utilitarianism were true, then let's imagine that there were a bunch of people, that everyone on Earth was being tortured all the time. Well, just creating babies to spawn into a lava pit would bring up the average utility, because the babies who will spawn into the lava pit are less miserable. So you should just spawn babies into a lava pit. And yet it seems like the correct moral view would not hold that we should spawn babies under a lava pit to not benefit anyone. And so that's just one of the
Hey, I'm sorry, we're spawning babies into a lava pit. This is proving what?
So everyone on Earth is currently horrendously miserable. So everyone's utility is -1 million. And if you spawn a baby into a lava pit, their utility will be -500,000. And so it will increase the average if you spawn slightly less miserable babies than the current average, if you just create them and spawn them into lava pits. And yet it seems like spawning babies into lava pits is immoral in most cases.
I'm just like, I'm sorry. I don't know if it's just because like we're at the end of the discussion now, but like I literally could not say, I could not describe what you're saying right now.
Okay, so I'll try one more time. So let's say that everyone on Earth is really miserable. Everyone's utility right now is -1 million. Well, it would increase the average utility if you made a bunch of really miserable people, but who are slightly less miserable than the currently existing people. Okay, and so if everyone is more miserable than the average baby being spawned into a lava pit, then spawning babies into lava pits would bring up the average. And yet it seemed, and so then it would be moral on average utilitarianism. And yet, as Parfit's fond of saying, this is, however, implausible, to say the least.
Well, here I thought we were at the end, but now I guess we're not. So that was a false ending. So there's actually something else I thought to ask you there, just like a categorization thing about utilitarianism. Like what is the classification of, sort of the different camps within utilitarianism? Didn't Peter Singer go from like a hedonist utilitarian to like a preference utilitarian?
No, other way around. The arc of Peter Singer is long, but it bends towards justice. So he went from a preference utilitarian to a hedonist utilitarian.
And what's the difference there, and what are the other options?
So there are basically three options. One of them, so I think that the least plausible is preference utilitarianism. It says that you should maximize people's fulfillment of their preferences. So just how much people get what they want. And yet it seems like that is false, given that, one, it seems like people can want things that don't make them well off. So a really depressed person might want to remain miserable because they don't feel they deserve to be happy. And yet it wouldn't seem like helping depressed people remain miserable. Like, it wouldn't seem like the world is better with depressed people who are more miserable just because they want to be miserable. And also, we can imagine really weird desire. Well, I think that some people's desires are circular, so there isn't a fact of the matter about how strong they are. And so if people have circular desires, or they prefer A to B, B to C, but C to A, then how do you even compare desires at that point? And I also think that there are counterexamples where, like, let's imagine that a person had a strong desire for you, like lighting a light on their grave 3,000 years later. Let's imagine that they had this really strong desire for it. Like, after they're dead, it wouldn't seem like it still matters. And if you think that you should light a candle on their grave, well, then you get this reductio where, let's imagine you had Google aliens who are all long dead, but who all would have a desire for, if humans were ever around, humans violently torturing themselves to death. Well, if there were enough of these aliens who now no longer have experiences, desire utilitarianism would seem to hold that you should maximize desire for it.
So preference utilitarianism is out, and then what are the other two?
So the second least plausible is objective list theory, which says that there's a list of things that make people well off, which include happiness, probably, maybe personal interactions, maybe knowledge. And I think that the objections I gave before are pretty potent. So I mean, one is, it seems like objective list theory has to hold, it's plausibly elitist. So it has to hold that things can be good for you, even if you don't like them and they don't make you happy. I also think that objective list theory has no account of why all the things that seem to be on the objective list generally are conducive to happiness, and we only care about them when they are. So we think friendship's valuable, but if you had a friend who, like, made you feel shitty all the time, it wouldn't seem like that was a valuable friendship. Similarly, if your marriage makes you feel shitty, it seems like you should get out of that marriage. Or if with knowledge, people say knowledge is intrinsically valuable, but just knowing, like, random irrelevant facts isn't valuable. It's only the important facts that are valuable. So all the things that are on the objective list only seem valuable when they produce suffering. Or sorry, when they produce well-being. It seems like I'm just misspeaking more as this.
No, I think it's kind of like when you say a word over and over and over again, and it kind of, like, loses meaning. It's like we've been talking about the same kind of thing for so long that, like, we're probably not even realizing that we're saying, like, the opposite at certain points of what we actually mean. But yeah.
So, and I also think that it can't account for the judgment that even if a person had Googleplex friends, if they were horrendously miserable all the time, they were just being viciously tortured. Even if they had a lot of friends, they would not be well off, no matter how many friends they had. So I think it can't account for that judgment.
And then the hedonistic utilitarianism, that's just like the more standard, like, pain pleasure kind of utilitarianism.
Yeah. And just to be clear, pain and pleasure are conceived very broadly. Yeah. So like, pleasure is just all the good experiences, and pain is just all the bad experiences.
I remember hearing Massimo Pialucci, like, a long time ago when I was first listening to, like, a podcast about this. He said something about utilitarianism and how it's obviously wrong, and he invoked, this very narrow conception of pain and pleasure. And then his co-host at the time, Julia Galef, was like, well, I mean, wouldn't a utilitarian also care about, like, has sadness and, like, other kinds of negative experiences? And he was like, nope, no, I don't think so. I think that would just make the whole theory meaningless. And I was like, that was the first time of many when I was like, Massimo Pialucci is not a good philosopher.
Yeah, no, he got, I think, wrecked in his debate with Craig.
He also got wrecked in his debate with Philip Goff, and he got wrecked. I mean, he's wrong about a really surprising number.
Oh, I need to watch the Philip Goff one. Yeah, I like when my team wins.
It was
That's
a
why
written
I watch
debate.
debates.
It was like a
okay.
letter back and forth. But
oh, nice. Okay.
Even other people who really hate panpsychism were like, "Yeah, Massimo, like you just don't. It seems like you just don't get what the idea is," which was also my read. But I'm saying people who normally hate panpsychism were like not even siding with him there.
Yeah. So then, yeah. So that's hedonism. Okay. So then there are other things. So there's act versus rule utilitarianism.
Right.
Rule utilitarianism says that you should act according to rules that would be best if society followed them. Rule utilitarianism is wildly implausible. So let's imagine that.
Wait, why? I thought isn't that what you were kind of getting at earlier with you know, where it's like the real life Sheriff Matthew or the real life Surgeon Matthew would not actually.
No, the act utilitarian thing to do in those cases isn't to kill people. Given that one act that's worth so the thing that you want to do, according to act utilitarianism, is take the set of acts that will make things go best. And so some of those acts involve, like, you know, caring about your friends and family, which explains why which gives rise to special obligations and such. But it doesn't, just because some rule would be good if society generally followed it, doesn't mean that I have any reason. Well, I mean, it may sometimes mean I have a reason to follow it, but it doesn't intrinsically mean that I have some reason to follow it. So let's imagine that unless society followed the rule, unless society adopted the view that it's not wrong to torture puppies, an evil demon would infinitely torture everyone. That would be a good rule to adopt. That wouldn't alleviate the badness of actually torturing puppies, as long as I adopt the view that it's not bad to torture puppies. And so it just doesn't seem to matter. Like, if there's some rule that's a good rule, but it's bad for me to follow that rule, and the world's worse when I follow that rule, then I don't have a reason to follow the rule. And it also plausibly lapses back into act utilitarianism, because it seems like maybe the best rule is just do whatever makes things go best. Just be an act utilitarian.
I thought that was kind of the grounding of rule utilitarianism, is it's saying, like, if you're trying to maximize the good acts and minimize the bad acts, then it's easier to have these rules of thumb and just tell everyone these are the rules.
No, so I agree with that. It is easy to have rules. It is better to have rules of thumb. And act utilitarianism doesn't disagree with that. Rule utilitarianism says that what matters is following good rules for society. But act utilitarianism, like, if you want to do the best acts, then it makes sense to not bring out your calculator every time when you're trying to decide whether to give someone a compliment. It makes, like, you'll do more good acts if you just generally act according to the rule. Like, just be nice to people. But so act utilitarianism can perfectly adequately say there are good rules of thumb that you should generally follow, or even that you should sometimes take actions which will make it so that you don't take other action that make things go best. So you should care. So you should take the action of caring a lot about your kids and being a good father, even if that would make it so that you'll sometimes not do the action that act utilitarianism would say is best. The difference is whether whatever would be the best rules for society, whether that matters for whether for what I should do.
See, like what you just described, I thought that just was rule utilitarianism.
No, it's not. Rule utilitarianism is something different.
Oh, okay. Can you just outline that difference one more time before we move on to another classificatory thing?
Yeah. Rule utilitarianism. So act utilitarianism says you should take the acts that make things go best. Rule utilitarianism says that you should act according to the rules, which, if followed by society, would make things go best.
Okay. I'm not sure. I can't really, at this moment, see the difference.
One of them says that you should do what, if you do it, will make things go best. One of them says that you should do what, if it were a societal rule, would make things go best.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. What about negative utilitarianism, asks
Yeah,
John
so that was going to be the next distinction. So positive utilitarianism says that we care about both happiness and suffering. Negative utilitarianism says that we only care about suffering, avoiding suffering, that happiness doesn't matter. Now, or that avoiding suffering is infinitely more important than happiness.
Yeah, I hear this from like antinatalists all the time, that like suffering is worse than pleasure is good.
Yeah, no, so I think that this is wildly implausible. So, I mean, if you say that any suffering is worse than any pleasure is good, then giving an infinite number of people infinite pleasure at the cost of one of them, like stubbing their toe, would be bad. And yeah, that's crazy. Now, you might say that there are some extreme forms of suffering that are so bad that they can't be outweighed, but I've previously argued against that notion earlier in this podcast. So, the arguments, one bad thing is no worse than two things that are 90% as bad, for things that are blah, 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 until it's less bad than a bunch of dust specks. It seems like a million dust specks is worth a million people experiencing unfathomable bliss. I have a more thorough article on this called Against Negative Utilitarianism. So I think negative utilitarianism is wildly implausible. There's also scalar utilitarianism versus like maximizing and satisficing. So maximizing utilitarianism just says that what you should. So scalar utilitarianism says that what you should do, like, doesn't have firm. So rather than having these super firm notions of like you should do X, it instead says that just there are things that it's best if you do this, second best if you do this. So how important it is to take an act scale is proportional to how much to how good the act is. So what you have most reason to do, we can say that that's what you should do. But it makes sense to think of them as, rather than right and wrong, as just different possible acts on a continuum of best to worst. That's scalar utilitarianism. Then there's satisficing utilitarianism, which says that all you have to do is make sure to like meet some minimal threshold of utility. And there's like maximizing utilitarianism, which says that like what you should do is that like you should that should doesn't lie on this continuum. It's just that you like should always do the best thing. I don't think that these fundamentally disagree. I think they're climbing the mountain on three sides. Well, I think satisficing maybe it does and is wrong, but I don't think the other two fundamentally disagree. Let's see. Are there other relevant distinctions in utilitarianism? I mean, there are a few like obscure ones, but there might be some that I'm like forgetting about. But one thing is there will be differences in terms of how people see the future. So you have someone like David Benatar who says that it's good to make people happy, but it's not good to make happy people. And specifically that it matters that future well-being doesn't matter. It's only future suffering that matters. And yet that's wildly implausible for a couple of reasons. One of them is that
he's constantly saying that like there's this asymmetry between pain and pleasure. Like, and that almost seems like a problem to me. Like in the past, I've just called it the asymmetry problem, because it to me, it just seems like an inconsistency. It's like, pain and pleasure just seem obviously like, equal and opposite.
Right. I agree with that. And if you say that future well-being doesn't matter, but future suffering is actively bad, well, then creating a paradise that would result in one person experiencing one scintilla of pain would be a bad thing. And it would be morally neutral to press a button. No, it would be morally good to press a button that would make no future person ever happy again, but that would cause one person to avoid getting a cut on their knee. And yet that's obviously crazy.
Yeah, affirming the asymmetry just leads to all these completely ludicrous results, like you just said.
Yeah.
Like it shouldn't even be controversial. It's not like, oh, well, yeah, I guess if you're a utilitarian, it just follows from the theory that would be bad. It's like, no, it follows from the theory, and it also is intuitively ridiculous. Some of the things that, people who affirm the asymmetry are like committed to.
Yeah.
Do you have any other classificatory things that you want to mention for this part that probably should have been at the beginning, but is instead at the end?
It's no, nothing that I can think of. Oh, I mean, I guess, well, this is not really a class. This is sort of, there are objectivists and subjectivists. So the objectivists think that it is moral realism, so that it is objectively the case that we should maximize well-being, and subjectivists don't think that there are moral facts that are mind independent. I fall much more on the it's not like much more. Like I follow solidly in the objectivist camp. I think that it is genuinely wrong to torture infants for fun. It's not just a matter of opinion.
Yeah, that's a meta-ethical distinction between realists and anti-realists. But I did just want to circle back to one thing, because I feel like I didn't make it clear of like some of the weird things that the people who affirm the asymmetry are committed to. Like, if you think that future pleasure is just not worth anything, but future pain is like a terrible thing that needs to be avoided, then if there's some future person who's going to have a life of bliss, but they're going to have a paper cut for 10 seconds, then it would be better, to quote David Benatar, it would be better to never have been. But that's obviously ridiculous. Like that person is having a great life. It's a life of bliss with 10 seconds of discomfort, but according to him, it would be better for that person not to have existed.
Right. And it would be fine to give everyone pills that will make it so that when they have a kid, their kid will never be happy.
Yeah, those people have psychological problems. I don't know why we're not allowed just to point out that, like, I mean, obviously you want to engage with antinatalism in like a good faith way and try to make arguments, but like we did just make an argument. It's obviously wrong, and people who continue to affirm it, it's like you need to see a therapist. Like you have psychological issues. You're depressed. Like there's something wrong. I'm sorry that things are not good. And I don't. I said that kind of tongue in cheek, and now I feel bad because I do remember there was this one antinatalist guy who like responded to a video I made one time, and that guy was like clearly in pain, and it made me kind of approach the issue like more seriously, I guess, because because I was just kind of flippantly saying like, oh, they have psychological problems, and it's like, no, that's actually true.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that oh, sorry. I think it was my knee was bumping into the table. I was table pounding. No, I mean, I think that Benatar doesn't seem. I mean, I think that antinatalism is plausibly correlated with mental illness, but it's certainly not true of all antinatalists. Some of them are just convinced by the philosophical arguments. Like, I mean, Benatar just seems like a pretty boring guy. I don't mean that in a like I mean that not in the sense of like he's uninteresting. He'd be an interesting guy to talk to, but in the sense of like, he doesn't seem like super eccentric in any way. He just seems like a sort of to just have particular moral intuitions.
Yeah, no, I mean, a couple of people who I know who are antinatalists just over the internet, like they are mentally ill, and they're in an incredible amount of pain all the time, and it might have been better for them not to have been born. And it yeah, anyway, I just feel bad because I said that so flippantly, like, oh, they have sight, and then I just remembered, oh, some of them actually do. That's part of why they're antinatalists. But anyway, yeah, negative utilitarianism and all those other views we were just kind of sketching out. I mean, they're just obviously wrong. They lead to such crazy absurdities.
Yeah, it turns out that every view other than hedonic act utilitarianism is obviously wrong and leads to crazy absurdities.
Well, you could be a low effort, lazy pluralist and just say whatever you want whenever it suits you, like I do.
Well, that leads to crazy views.
It leads to no crazy views. That's the advantage of it.
Well, it leads to sacrificing an infinite amount of simplicity. And so
it leads to sacrificing some consistency, maybe. And yeah, it's way more complicated, but who cares about simplicity in a normative theory?
It's infinitely complicated, and I care about
simplicity. It's not infinitely complicated.
It is.
It's just more complicated. You have a very simple theory that leads to weird outcomes that you shouldn't accept.
But you'd expect the correct theory to appear to lead to weird outcomes, given that your moral intuitions are quite fallible. Well, and if we look throughout history at when it's led to weird outcomes, utilitarianism.
Yeah, no, that's true. It in the past, it's like it did lead to weird outcomes that turned out to be true, but still, I like to I like taking the path of least resistance. So.
Yeah, I have some objections to moral particularism, other than the fact that it's infinitely complex. I mean, I just think that there are obviously some true moral principles, like that you shouldn't torture infants for small amounts of fun.
I can't speak on behalf of like particularism, but I feel like the idea that I'm defending is not that there are no moral principles, just that principles are not sort of absolute. Like you don't want to take them so seriously to think that you have an adequate, successful conceptual analysis of like what it means for something to be good. You just have something that's like pretty good that works for a lot of cases, but you shouldn't sort of go overboard and think that you have like almost like a geometrically precise conceptual analysis of the good.
But think about, okay, so I think that it does run into problems, but I mean, just think about, be a Bayesian Emerson for a moment, okay? No. Think about
Never.
think about what we'd expect if utilitarianism were true. Or, well, wouldn't we expect? So, or I mean, the principle can be utilitarianism, but it doesn't have to be. It can be some principle that's derivative of utilitarianism. Like we'd expect it to have apparent counterexamples, given that we're very fallible. And so then the fact that it does what we'd expect on the theory is not evidence. As T-Jump says, it's zero evidence. No, but it is actually zero evidence because it's exactly what we'd expect on the theory. And then every time when we try to analyze the intuition turns out to be something that there were like a dozen arguments for why we should abandon.
No, I mean, I feel like you're biting the bullet there in a way that people don't want to do. Like, I feel like you're biting a bullet that other people wouldn't, where you're saying, well, it turns out this initially counterintuitive thing is right. I think a lot of people would actually I think most people don't want to bite the bullet along with you.
Well, okay, but so regardless of what most people do, that's not relevant to what's correct. Well,
everyone disagrees with you, to quote T-Jump. Everyone thinks you're wrong.
I mean, it is. Look, I mean, I know you've drunk the argument from near universal agreement Kool-Aid for the existence of God, but I mean, in terms of complex normative domains, I don't trust the judgments of the average person that much. I mean, I trust them to some degree.
I do. But I'm a man of the people. Unlike you, you're an elitist, an aristocratic elitist.
Yeah, right. But I mean, if you just look back, so your point seemed to be that we don't want to bite the bullet, but we should bite the bullet. So if you're rejecting a principle because it seems to have a counterexample, but we know based on the history of our moral intuitions that that our moral intuitions are often wrong, then it would turn out that that what we'd expect on the hypothesis, given how much disagreement there is, and how much how wrong we've been throughout history, saying that our moral intuitions are so reliable that when we disagree with a theory, like upon occasion, despite the theory doing super well throughout history, being derivable from a variety of diverse and plausible axioms, doing well in terms of theoretical virtues, and every time we analyze a case in detail, it turns out that it's like really hard to maintain our initial counterintuitive judgment. And it also explains a huge amount of moral data. Given all that, it just seems like we should that's not a good reason to reject it.
But I mean, utilitarianism is also ultimately based on intuitions that you think are plausible. And then when utilitarianism as a theory has implications that clash with other intuitions that seem equally as plausible, then, I mean, that's why I feel like it's losing out for me. It's not that, like, I mean, it feels weird. It feels like you're kind of having it both ways with moral intuitions here, where, like, of course you want to found like utilitarianism on moral intuitions, but then when it, has these implications that clash with intuitions, then suddenly intuitions don't matter anymore.
No, so intuitions are some intuitions are some evidence. But intuitions are evidence if they are not what we would expect. So let me rephrase. So we're X is evidence for Y if the probability of X given Y is higher than the probability of X given not Y, or maybe other way around. Whatever, you get the idea. So then the question is, if we consider an intuition, we need to consider, well, is this the type of intuition that we would expect to have if utilitarianism turned out to be correct? And so versus if it turned out to be incorrect. Well, if it turned out to be incorrect, it's really unlikely that that we'd have lots of different intuitions that point in favor of a series of diverse axioms that all point towards utilitarianism. So I know of no other theory other than utilitarianism for which there are like 5 plausible ways of deriving them from first principles. And so it would just be unexpected if our first principle derivations all happen to converge in very similar ways. And so it would be surprising if they appear to converge on the wrong theory. So those are the types of intuition that would be relatively surprising. But then I think our intuitions are right most of the time. But let's say they're right 95% of the time. Well, that would still mean that 5% of the time they're going to be wrong. And so if 5% of the time our intuitions disagree with utilitarianism, well, then that's what we'd expect on the hypothesis that utilitarianism were correct. But
it's also what we would expect if it weren't correct. I mean, we would expect our intuitions to clash with utilitarianism.
Well, but hold on for a minute. But what we wouldn't expect if utilitarianism were wrong is for when we analyze the scenarios in depth, for there to be lots of bullets that we have to bite to maintain the original judgment. So,
yeah, but see, that's where people aren't going to agree with this step in the argument, because they're not going to bite the bullets that you're willing to bite.
Well, no. So it's not about the bullets that I'm willing to bite. It's about the bullets that they have to bite in order to reject the judgment.
Okay.
Take the example of the example of when I owned you before on the point about torture versus death specs. So on the hypothesis that utilitarianism were correct, we'd expect it to in cases like torture versus death specs. That seems like the type of case where we'd expect our intuitions to go awry, given that there are plausible heuristics of which it runs afoul. But what we wouldn't expect is for there to be seemingly airtight arguments that you have to reject. And so the way I think of it is like, let's imagine that we have some method for identifying the truth 95% that's 95% accurate. We have this machine, this magic 8-ball, that it gets things right 95% of the time. This 8-ball is like our intuitions. And then we apply it to some formula. And we want to figure out if the formula is correct. And so we apply it to the formula. And what do you know? It agrees with the formula 95% of the time. Well, okay. And then we take the 5% of cases where it disagrees. And then we try to solve them in other ways. And when we try to solve them in other ways, those other ways also disagree with utilitarianism. Or sorry, when we try to solve it in other ways, those ways seem to agree with the formula rather than the judgment of the magic 8-ball. Well, then that's really good evidence that the formula is correct, because when we try to solve them in other ways by analyzing other arguments, they seem to point towards the original intuitions. And then we figure out that we have some reason to expect that the 8-ball would malfunction in these 5% of types of cases. These cases tend to be weird cases where the 8-ball is not structurally designed to solve them, so it's more likely that they'd malfunction in that case. And then we also know that throughout history, when people have compared the magic 8-ball to this formula, the formula has generally been right. And then the formula also has prima facie plausibility and can be proved in a variety of diverse ways, all of which seem really intuitive. At that point, of course, we trust the formula.
Okay.
So when we do a sophisticated Bayesian analysis of our intuitions, they end up supporting utilitarianism.
Well, I think that's a fantastic point to end on the impassioned case for utilitarianism. But I know that you would never make this mistake. But I know that some people, what you're saying, I feel like you're walking kind of a dangerous tightrope with moral intuitions. And like I said, I don't think you would make this mistake, but I think a lot of people would be way too quick to kind of devalue moral intuition as a whole because they haven't really thought about it, I think. But yeah, I mean, if you devalue moral intuition too much, then you're going to undermine the justification for utilitarianism in the first place. So I know that you're aware of that, but I just think that other people who might be on your side would be a little bit too dismissive of our moral intuitions that appear to clash with utilitarianism.
Right.
Or moral intuitions as a whole, which, you can't dispense with moral intuitions.
Right. For my fellow utilitarians, I'd say, moral intuitions are clearly evidence, and they're how we confirm a theory. And if it turned out, let's imagine that you had this way of just picking thought experiments at random, just random possible segments of modal space. If it turned out that utilitarianism was wrong, or diverged from our intuitions half the time in those cases, then that would be very solid evidence against utilitarianism. But if it diverges from our intuitions only in a small percentage of cases, and then when we reflect more, those intuitions become hard to maintain, given that that's what we would expect if utilitarianism were true, when utilitarianism is supported by so many strong intuitions of the type that we wouldn't expect to have if utilitarianism were false, then the evidence just overwhelmingly supports utilitarianism.
And if you reject moral intuitions too fully, then you've kind of undermined the basis of utilitarianism in the first place. I've been reading Ethical Intuitionism lately, and I'm getting very intuition-pilled. But yeah, that's another great book by Humer. So are you good with bringing? We just passed the 3-hour mark, which I was subconsciously aiming for as soon as we passed the 2-hour and 45-minute mark. But now that we've reached Joe Rogan levels of podcasting, I think that might be a good place to end. We don't want to hit we don't want to hit digital gnosis levels of podcasting. We want to only hit Joe Rogan levels.
Yeah, no, just another 8 hours in terms of digital gnosis levels. 150 plus arguments, 500 plus arguments for utilitarianism, and for every one of them, there's like a modal version. It's possibly necessarily the case. Yeah. Okay, we could wrap this up. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's nice to, I mean, I talk about moral philosophy like once every 6 months on the podcast. So yeah, so now that I've got my quota in for the next 6 months, I can rest easy until
Atheists have no
2022.
morals.
Right. Well, there was a guy going pretty nuts in the chat who was trying to say that, and I kind of just ignored him. Othello completely.
Yeah. How is happiness good if there is no God to enjoy it?
There's no way to say that happiness is good and pain is bad if God wasn't commanding it. I guess it's funny because like so many theists aren't even divine command theorists because they're not subjectivists basically on like a cosmic scale. But yeah, divine command theory is great. Even if you're a theist, don't be a divine command theorist.
Yeah, be like Swinburne. Reject divine command. Reject God's necessity and reject divine command theory.
Okay. Well, with that, I think that I'm actually going to hit the end broadcast now.
All right.
End broadcast. Okay. Okay, fuck it. What were you about to say? It better not start another 15-minute thing. Okay, you have 10 seconds.
Oh, I don't have anything. I don't remember what I was going to say.
Okay, it seems like you really had something that you wanted to say, but we're going to end the broadcast now. Thank you. There are some people who have somehow stuck with us for this whole 3 hours. So thanks to everybody for watching. Thank you for the super chats. Make sure that you click on the links in the description. And yeah, I've been Emerson Green. My brain is completely fried, and my brain hurts. Goodbye.
Wait, I think you're supposed to say this has been counter-apologetics or something.
This has actually been Walden Pod. This has not been counter-apologetics, but yes.
Oh, are they different?
Yes, there are 2 podcasts. They started off as 2 podcasts, and then only like later did I even start doing YouTube stuff. Because I don't really like YouTube, but anyway. I've been Emerson Green, and this is actually Walden Pod. And I will see you next time.